Good morning and welcome to the 6th meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2026. This morning we have Emma Roddick, Rhoda Grant and Alistair Allen attending remotely. Before we begin, as normal, can I ask everyone to ensure their electronic devices are switched to silent. Our first item on the agenda this morning is consideration of whether to take item 5 in private. Are we all agreed? We are agreed, thank you. Our next item of business is consideration of the Sea Fish Prohibition on Fishing, Firth of Clyde Order 2026, SSI 2026/10. And I welcome to the meeting Mary Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Islands, Land Reform and Islands, and her Scottish Government officials. We have Dr Coby Needles from who's the Chief Fisheries Advisor for Scotland. Good morning. And Jim Watson, the Head of the Domestic Fisheries Management from the Marine Directorate. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I think I just want to start by setting out clearly why action is required, what the order is going to deliver and how we intend to work with stakeholders throughout the implementation of it. Now, firstly, I do recognise the strong issues and views around this. From the outset, I want to be clear that the purpose of the order is to support the recovery of cod stocks in the Firth of Clyde while meeting both our environmental and our socio-economic responsibilities. That balance isn't optional, it is something that's essential. Seasonal management measures in the Clyde have been in place since 2002, but despite strengthened protections over the years, the scientific advice remains concerning. We know that spawning stock biomass is still very low. And although there are some signs of stability, improvement remains limited. Cod fishing mortality is too high, and while the precise drivers aren't yet fully understood, what is clear is that the recovery is possible. I know from the evidence the committee heard that stakeholders differ on how best to intervene. However, there was broad acknowledgement of the need to protect this stock, and I believe that this order provides a proportionate and a structured way to do that. Now, I want to take a moment to set out what the order and the targeted scientific programme will actually deliver, because I think there has been some confusion around that. Now, the order will maintain the seasonal closure in the same area for 2026 to 28, covering all gear types. It will allow limited access for certain creel and trawl vessels to carry out scientific research, complemented by wider research across the Clyde throughout the year, and restrict access to the wider Firth of Clyde to vessels with a valid historic track record from 2023 to 25, or those undertaking authorised scientific work. This is essential both to support the scientific programme as well as to prevent any new or displaced fishing effort undermining recovery. Now, alongside this, the 3-year targeted scientific programme will strengthen the evidence base that has historically been lacking. The programme will draw on all available data, monitor bycatch and discards across all sectors, and carry out additional surveys to support future stock assessments. It's been designed together with local fishers and scientific experts using Marine Directorate vessels where appropriate and commercial fishing vessels. This is about fairness, consistency and delivering practical, robust evidence. And crucially, this programme enables an adaptive management approach, meaning that new measures can be introduced during the 3-year science programme as new evidence emerges. So to be clear, a 3-year SSI doesn't mean that no further action will be taken within that time. Now, without that flexibility, existing data gaps are going to persist and our ability to implement proportionate effective measures will be limited. During the 3-year work programme, the policy will be kept under review and will provide the committee with an annual progress report, ensuring that there is that transparency and accountability throughout the 3-year period. So, taken together, the order and the scientific programme represent precautionary, proportionate action, a stronger evidence base for the future and a clear alignment with the sustainability and environmental duties set out in the Fisheries Act 2020. Now, if the order doesn't pass, it would leave a depleted stock without safeguards at a time when scientific advisers are increasingly concerned about the long-term outlook. I'm committed to a sustainable evidence-based approach, one that works with local fishers, that is balanced and adaptive and that meets our environmental and socio-economic responsibilities. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions the committee might have.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. In the last paragraph you said you wanted to take an evidence-based approach. That doesn't appear to be what's happening at all. You also suggested there was a range of different views from stakeholders and the witnesses we've had, but there was only a range on how they thought they should approach future policies, but they all agreed, almost unanimously, that this SSI in front of us doesn't do anything at all to preserve cod stocks. And looking through the evidence that we've had and the various pieces of correspondence, and indeed your own letter to the committee, there appears to be inconsistencies to the letter you wrote. Whilst he acknowledges that the Clyde-specific evidence is that there is high productivity means that the fish disturbance is unlikely to be a major factor. But at the same time, you're suggesting that the evidence for disturbance being an issue is lacking. So is it correct that there is no direct evidence from the Clyde demonstrating that fishing activity disrupts cod spawning?
Again, I think you have that quite clearly set out in the letter that I sent to committee, where we do set that out quite clearly. As I've said in the letter, it is correct there is no direct evidence from the Clyde demonstrating that fishing activity disrupts cod spawning. But then, if you read on from that, I'm saying that it's also true that the Strathclyde model suggests that the stock maintained relatively high productivity, at least up until 2019, implying that spawning may not be the main problem limiting stock recovery, and sets out the evidence that we'd introduced and brought forward over the previous years that we've discussed this order were based on a hypothesis about spawning areas, and some of the recent observations of actively spawning cod out with the closure have cast some doubt on that hypothesis. Now, there has been a number of developments in the intervening years since I was last here to discuss the previous order, not least the Strathclyde model that I know was discussed in the committee's session. And again, there are specific issues within that, though, which and data gaps that we need to address, which is why we set out the order in the way that we have and are bringing forward those proposals, and are also proposing the targeted scientific programme.
Yeah, I'm still confused. So all the data suggests that spawning may not be the main problem limiting stock recovery. But this SSI doesn't bring anything in, or bring anything to the table which actually addresses anything other than spawning. So, you know, we've heard evidence of the economic and socio-economic impact on these closures, but there's no evidence of the Marine Directorate doing anything actually to address what is the main problem limiting stock recovery. It's all about spawning, but there is absolutely no evidence that spawning is the issue here.
Well, first of all, I would say that the order maintains the closure, and I think that is the precautionary and the proportionate approach to take, so that we're at least providing that minimum protection for cod during that period of the closure.
But it's again, a point where they don't need protected.
But, Convener, I was coming on to it. I mean, the purpose of this work, I think we can't look at the order in isolation, because the key to the order and the work that's proposed is the scientific programme as well, because it's about filling some of those data gaps, because the work that we're proposing to undertake will, first of all, enable us to look at, well, where the cod are actually spawning. We'll be able to do more of that work, as well as looking at the bycatch across the different fleet segments. But I don't know if Kobe would want to come in on the science points in particular.
Yes, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Morning, everyone. On the disturbance point is an interesting one that you raise. The disturbance was used initially as a driver for the spawning closure, really in the lack of evidence at the time, one way or the other. And I think that's still the case in a sense. You can't really have evidence that, or there's no evidence of disturbance affecting spawning. Then again, there's no evidence that it doesn't. You can't really tell either way. It's a difficult one. So I think in this situation, we've got the Strathclyde assessment model now, which we didn't have previously. That's been published. That's an excellent piece of work that I think we all agree with in terms of the overall direction of stock dynamics that was implying up to 2019. Since 2019, we have survey data that we've produced from Scotia that is not indicating any stock recovery in the area, so the cod stock is still in a poor state. And I think in that situation, when you have a stock that's maintaining at a poor state, it may be that the spawning closure is preventing it from declining further. We don't know. So that's, I think, in general, if you have a stock that's in a poor state, and you have a management measure that's trying to protect it at least during part of the year, it doesn't seem precautionary or really appropriate necessarily to remove that without knowing much more about it. Then allied to the SSI, we have the targeted science programme, and part of the idea behind that is to determine exactly where where spawning is happening in the Clyde. The spawning closure was based on a hypothesis about spawning behaviour and the sort of benthos that cod need in order to be able to spawn, but that's a fairly blunt instrument. I think as we get more information going forward through this TSP, both from our survey information and from bycatch data that we can get from the across the fleet sectors, I think we'll get a clearer idea. The intention is we'll get a clearer idea of where spawning is happening. Closures can be more precisely targeted to those spawning areas to try and protect that spawning activity rather than this sort of broad brush approach that we have just now. That's for spawners. There's not much point protecting spawners if you don't then also try and protect the juveniles. So at the same time, the TSP is going to try and look at, okay, where are the juvenile areas in the Clyde that we can also try and protect. So I think it's to make the management instrument much more evidence-based as we go forward and much more dynamic in a sense. So it's really targeting where, targeting management measures where they need to be and not having them where we don't need them anymore.
Yeah, and I'm still confused because the stock in the Cabinet Side zone was stock maintained relatively high productivity despite fishing pressure. So that wouldn't suggest that fishing pressure is actually having the impactful, it's not impacting on the cod population, it's something else. So, I'm not a scientist, but the man in the street looking at this would read stock maintained relatively high productivity. And we could add in there, despite fishing pressures. So would it be even better, you're suggesting? And would that then have a long-term impact on the cod population?
If I can come in again, yeah, what I interpret that as is to say that at least up until 2019, the indications from the assessment model were that the productivity of the stock was maintaining at a relatively high level. What has happened since 2019 in the 6 years since then, we don't yet know because we haven't updated that assessment model to the present day. So that's one thing. It also indicates that there's the potential. The good thing about that, I think, is that there's the potential for the stock to recover if cod productivity is relatively high. So it's productivity in the sense that each spawner is producing. Is trying to produce more young in order to fill in the gaps in the population, essentially. So it's that kind of productivity. If you still have high fishing pressure, high fishing mortality, which we think is still the case on the spawners, each of those spawners might have high productivity, but if there's not a lot of them, then, if you see what I mean, the stock's not necessarily going to recover all that quickly.
Yeah, but the spawners are not going to be affected by this.
But if there's less spawners, then if there's less spawners because of high fishing pressure, then...
During spawning, though?
Well, during spawning
surely the spawners are there and they're going to spawn. And what's going to be affected through this closure is the act of spawning. It's not actually the number of spawners. That is down to some other fishing pressure.
Okay.
Is that not what the situation is? Because there is no indication that the spawners that are there are not spawning. So you're suggesting it's the number of spawners that is potentially causing the issue. But this SSI is not going to reduce the number of spawners because there's no indication that they spawn any less because of fishing pressures or fishing at the time of spawning.
What the SSI, or what the closed area currently does, is it closes off an area of the Clyde for 11 weeks, 12 weeks. So you've removed that element of mortality anyway from that area. So you will have reduced fishing mortality to a certain extent on that area. Now, there's arguments about displacement of activity going to different areas. So the impact on the overall fishing mortality for the year might not be all that significant. But I think what the closed area is more about is trying to give those animals as much of an opportunity as they can to spawn. What I think the productivity argument is about is that say, OK, if they're given the opportunity to spawn, then the likelihood is that they're going to produce more eggs in order to try and fill in the gaps.
OK, thank you. I've got a supplement from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. Just on something that Dr Needle said about the SSI, did I pick you up right when you said there could be further measures imposed under this SSI without the need to come back with another SSI. And that would concern me a bit if there was measures imposed that happened without reference to the Parliament or indeed without consultation.
Sorry, if I could just jump in on that point, I think and I think some of what I'd outlined in my opening comments too is that the intention of this scientific programme would be adaptive. So again, any learning that we would be picking up through that programme, we would look to take forward, and it's not a case of waiting for 3 years before we take any action, but it certainly wouldn't be the intention to bypass Parliament. And again, I think what I've set out in my opening comments too would be intending to provide updates. And it's also important to remember, I think, other pieces of work that we're taking forward, which I think could well be implemented during the period of this order if it's passed by the committee and by the Parliament, such as the future catching policy work that we've been working on for the past few years, which is about improving selectivity for various parts of the fleet as well. So I think it's certainly not the intention that anything would be done in a way to bypass Parliament during that period. So I don't know if that's what you were getting at.
I think what would be better was to have an assurance that if any further measures were going to be taken under the powers given under the SSI, that those would come back to Parliament and indeed be consulted on rather than imposed.
Again, well, I think just even in terms of the work that I've just mentioned there, the future catching policy, we're actually intending to consult on that within the next couple of weeks in relation to those measures. So again, all of that will be open to consultation, and we engage closely with our stakeholders. I think also to point out in relation to the scientific programme, there will be a working group overseeing that, which will have fishermen represented on it. It will have other academics and scientists represented on it, as well as ourselves, to really oversee that work and how it's implemented going forward. But I'm happy to keep the committee updated as to how that work is progressing, and indeed I made that commitment during my opening comments too.
I think we would be happier with a commitment that you will come back to this committee or a future committee if there is any more closures or restrictions to be imposed, rather than use this SSI to put those through.
Again, I think that would be within everybody's best interest to do that. We would want to keep the committee updated if there were to be any changes. As I say, I think the whole intention of this is that it is adaptive. We take the learning as we go. It's not hitting the pause button for 3 years, and that we would be informing the committee of that work and keeping the committee updated.
But the committee wouldn't. I'm really looking for a guarantee that this wouldn't be imposed without reference back to the committee and the ability to scrutinise and vote on it.
Sorry, I might bring Jim in a moment, because I think if we were to make any substantive changes that would impact the order, it would mean we could potentially bring back another order if that's what that meant, or if that's what was required at that time. But sorry, I'll ask Jim for further advice.
Yeah, and maybe just to elaborate on how we envisage this working month to month, working with the stakeholders. So you've, Cabinet Secretary has mentioned the working group. That will include fishers that are working in the area, both static control fishers. It will include scientific experts as well. And that is about trying to make sure that whatever resources are deployed, whatever work is undertaken in the area, is helping provide the best value. And where there's new evidence that comes along as a result of that research, obviously we'll be taking that back, we'll be discussing it with the group, and we'll be reporting back through the normal channels as well. Yeah.
I'm really concerned that you won't give me a guarantee that if other measures are being imposed, that you won't bring it back to the Parliament with an opportunity to vote on it. But I don't think I'm going to get that.
Sorry, I think if I could just provide clarity on one point. Obviously, the order that we have set out here is very specific in terms of it sets out the area that is closed. Should there be any changes to that, or should we identify that the closure wasn't in the right place, we would have to bring back another instrument, because that instrument is only there for that specific area. So any changes, we would have to come back, we would have to consult, and as well as provide all the impact assessments that we've done for this order, and there would be that parliamentary scrutiny of it. So again, I think that we would have to do that. So I think that's as as much of a guarantee as I can give.
Convener, will I go to my substantive question?
No, we've got a number of other supplementaries. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. You were just saying that this is a specific order, and there's obviously other work going on, looking at fishing in general, looking at other species, other collaboration going on, working with fishermen, whether it's the pelagic fishermen or the inshore people. So there's obviously other work that's going on that feeds into, I suppose, the intelligence and the knowledge that we use in order to make these decisions. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, we've seen in the past couple of years how I think some pieces of work that have developed within that time since the last period of the closure. And again, as I've touched on, I think the future catching policy is probably the key piece of work, again, that we'll be consulting on over the course of the next couple of weeks, because that's about ensuring that we're minimising bycatch. It's a piece of work that's been ongoing for a number of years, working with different fleet segments, and really about trying to improve selectivity. Again, so some of those measures could come forward and be implemented over the course of this order, which is going to obviously hopefully improve the situation and minimise bycatch too. So again, that will be going into consultation over the course of the next few weeks. There are also some overarching pieces of work that the committee will be aware of, such as the Inshore Fisheries Management Programme too. I think the framework that we've been looking at and that we've put out a call for evidence for previously about how we manage our inshore fisheries across the country, and looking more towards that regional approach as well. So again, there's always a lot of work that goes on in our marine environment. I think that those are some of the key pieces, and as I say, the future catching policy work is the one that will probably be most integral to this going forward.
Okay, thanks.
I know we're going to come back to the scientific trials a little bit later, but I just wanted, and Dr Coote will put it into far better words than I attempted to do previously. In the evidence session, Dr Coote suggests there's two very important points that question whether closing a spawning area is the most useful thing to do. If you look at production rates, the number of juveniles that are producing females in the Clyde stock, it increased rapidly before the spawning closure was introduced. That was a direct response to heavy exploitation. So he's also suggesting it means that fish are being caught before they spawn. So when a spawning closure is introduced, it is too late. Much of the spawning potential has already been lost by catching the fish when they were young. That is why one should question if we want to produce a more productive or healthier stock, is introducing a spawning closure really the optimal thing to do? So the damage has been done before spawning, and actually the closures have not had any influence on the success of that spawning period. I think that's what I was trying to get across. So this SSI is not targeted at where the problem actually is.
But again, I think that's why the targeted scientific programme is so important, because it's about making sure, do we have the closure in the right place? Again, coming back to the letter that I sent the committee about the closure, what we'd based that on, and it was based on that hypothesis about spawning areas, and some of the recent activity that we've seen of actively spawning cod out with the closure has cast doubt on that hypothesis. The bycatch as well, I think the Strathclyde model highlights that, but again, that's why the targeted scientific programme is trying to fill all these evidence gaps in the round. It's about looking at the bycatch, because again, some of that data only goes up to 2019. We need to update that. We need to look at what's happening on the ground just now with bycatch, as well as then trying to bottom out some of the gaps that exist there.
Yeah, OK. I know we're going to come on to it later, but it suggests the evidence is already there that bycatch is the problem, not the spawning. I think that's quite clear. But I'm not going to step on any other members' toes, because we will be coming to that. I'm going to move now on to a question from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask what quantitative evidence the Marine Directive have on non-trawl fishing mortality in the Clyde, and especially that there's bycatch estimates, and what data is that based on, and how does the creel bycatch estimates compare with the net trawl bycatch?
I'll come to Kobe, who will be able to provide more detail on the specifics of that in a moment. But I think, again, just to be clear, I think in the response that I have sent to committee, it set out that we don't have, it's not the quantitative evidence that we have, it's the qualitative evidence. And as I've outlined in that letter, the scientists at the Marine Directorate have seen cod and other whitefish in creel catches. And again, I think it's from some of that work, what's been observed, is what highlights that this is an area that needs to be looked at, but Kobe will be able to provide more information. Yes,
thanks. So as you'll know, the trawl bycatch information comes from an observer programme that we run, and that's been successfully run for many years, since 1975 actually. It had a pause during COVID, of course, but has picked up again. So, and that's part of the TSP is to really try and reinvigorate that in the Clyde, because there have been observers on the trawl fleet, but not probably as many as we would like, I think, or as many as we would need to get a representative estimate. So that's the trawls. The creelers, it's difficult, or has historically been difficult to get creelers involved in an observer programme. They tend to be single-handed vessels, and we have regulations against sending observers on single-handed vessels in case someone falls overboard. Essentially, it's a health and safety issue. So we don't have... The creelers historically have not been included in the standard observer programme that we have. What we have in terms of information on creel bycatch is a number of observations, not from the Clyde, but from different parts of Scotland, to suggest that cod can be caught in creels. For example, we are running, I was going to mention we're starting up a project called Codscape, which is looking at selectivity of cod in creels and how to redesign creels actually to be less selective for cod. So this is a part of the TSP going forward. The cod that we use for those experiments, tank experiments with creels, come from a creeler on the East Coast who's very capable of catching cod, live cod, in his creels. We also have information from the north of Scotland, from trips that were undertaken on a crab vessel, and again, cod is being caught in those creels. We have information from the recent Solway trials and the Solway lobster fishery, the crab and lobster fishery, where again you can see cod being caught in creels. And we have underwater footage that we've been taking ourselves we position a camera within creels at different depths and see what is being caught by standard creels in Scottish waters. And you do tend to get a lot of cod, a reasonable amount of cod in these vessels, in these creels. So they tend to be small cod because of the structure of the creels, but you know, if a significant number of small cod are being caught in a creel, then that's going to add up to a fairly significant impact on mortality. So the TSP, part of that is to look at can we monitor cod bycatch in creels if it exists. Now, that it may be the case, I don't know, it may be the case that there isn't an issue for cod bycatch in creels in the Clyde. It may be something to do with the cod there, maybe something to do with the creels they're using, maybe something to do with the environment. It's possible that they're not catching any cod, and part of the TSP then would be to demonstrate that, and then we could move forward with management appropriately. But our experience from observing creels in other parts of Scotland, admittedly not the Clyde, but other parts of Scotland, is that they are very capable of catching cod. So it's a concern, and I think it's worthy of further consideration to address this issue in the Clyde, if possible.
But is it not the case that if you caught a cod in a creel, you just let it go? It's not like it dies. It's not like it's caught up in a net with other fish, and by the time you reach it, it's already dead. If you pull it up in a creel, it's being protected by the creel until it lands on the boat, at which time you take it out of the creel and put it back in the water.
So part of what we have to do with the creel monitoring is not only to determine how many cod are being caught in creels, which, as I say, may or may not be a problem, but also actually the fate of the cod once they're brought on board. So if those cod are released straight back into the water, there probably isn't an issue, because we know from as I mentioned, we get our live cod for our tank experiments from a creeler. So those are perfectly viable animals, and if they're put straight back in the sea, that's not mortality. That's fine. But if they're not put back in the sea, if they're used for something else, then that would be an issue. So our observations in the past have noted that what tends to happen, on some vessels at least, is that the cod are used as, cod that are caught can be used as bait in subsequent creels. So I guess they're not wasted, but at the same time, they're taken out of the population. So that's something we'd need to know about for the assessment model.
But would it therefore not be more sensible to have a catch and release policy rather than a prohibition in creel fishing?
That's more of a management issue, probably.
Well, again, I think, first of all, that's why the science programme is so important, because it's about evidencing exactly what happens and what is going on, rather than us making assumptions about what might be happening at sea.
Yeah.
But Jim, I don't know if there's more you would add to that.
Probably the only thing to add to that would be that, as part of the science programme, we're not prohibiting creel fishing in the closed area. We will be allowing some creel fishing activity to be undertaken for scientific reasons, and there'll be certain conditions on access to that area. And again, it's helping trying to build up that picture if this indeed is an issue, or if it's not. But yeah, Kobe makes a point about it's not just about what is caught in the creel, it's what then happens to as a result of that, whether it is used for bait, whether it's put back alive, or whether it's taken home for a fry indeed. So these things need to be looked at, and also what we also need to consider is the type of gear that's being used, and perhaps at the time of year as well. It may not be an issue for 10 months of the year, it might just be 2 months of the year where you've got perhaps a bit of a bycatch issue. But that's the whole point of the scientific programme, is to build up that picture in the Clyde in particular, but it is relevant for elsewhere in Scotland.
Beatrice Wishart. Oh, sorry, Rhoda, did you?
That's fine.
Thank you. Beatrice.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. You described the government's position as a risk-based precautionary approach, but precautions applied to justify an existing measure which evidence suggests is the wrong approach and is ineffective. And it's not applied to address, the known principal source of the mortality, which in this case is the nephrops trawl. So can you explain this approach, please?
Again, the approach that we've set out, I believe, is balanced. I think it's precautionary, and I also think it's proportionate. Now, I've set out in my letter to committee, again, what the evidence that we based the previous orders on that we're still using here, but of course, some of the observations that we've seen in intervening periods have mean that we're questioning the hypothesis on which we'd based previous decisions. We have the Strathclyde model that's emerged in that interim period, but there are also significant gaps within that we need to try and fill, so we get this complete picture. So again, that's why we've brought forward the order in the way that we have, with the accompanying targeted scientific programme, so that we can get that complete picture and then adapt the management as is necessary throughout that time.
Is there credible evidence that creel fishing is a significant driver of cod decline?
Again, all I can set out and re-emphasise is what I've already set out to the committee in that letter, and through some of what Kobe has outlined in terms of what has been observed by scientists in the Marine Directorate, which means it's something we need to look at. Now, it may not be significant, but again, we need to be able to categorically rule that out if that is the case, and look at it and ensure that we're looking all the different parts of the fleet as a whole, so that we get a complete picture of the fishing mortality, as well as trying to fill the other evidence gaps that we have. Because I think the important thing to remember with that model is the lack of historical data that's counted as part of it. Obviously, there isn't any data from the past 7 years that's been used, and we've had the closures within that time too. Again, we don't have that information on the creel bycatch. So I think it's important that we, again, work on that precautionary basis, at least maintain the closure. As Jim has outlined, and as I talked about in my opening comments as well, there will be some limited activity through that closure, again, for scientific purposes. But I do believe the approach that we've set out is the proportionate one and the balanced one to take.
And can you explain why 3 years is needed? I mean, there's been suggestions that of 1 year being much better than blocking this off for 3 years?
Again, first of all, I think I'll bring in Kobe in a moment on that, purely because that's on the, we've proposed that on the basis of advice from our scientific advisors as to why 3 years is appropriate. But again, just to emphasise, it doesn't mean that nothing will happen within 3 years. And again, we want that management to be adaptive if there's learning or evidence that we're collecting in that time as well. So it's not as if it's going to be everything we hit pause on for 3 years. But I'll hand over to Kobe for that.
Yeah, the 3 years is an estimate. Generally, if we say we start a new survey in an area of sea, we generally wouldn't use the information from that survey for about 3 to 4 years, because there may be something unusual in the first year, there may be something unusual in the second year, and it's not, you need to build up a time series of information, really. So the point about running this targeted science programme for 3 years is that we'll have a set of observations from the first year, and we'll see those observations again in the second year, and we'll start to get a picture of what the underlying true situation is. And by the third year, our uncertainty in our estimates will start to reduce significantly. But it may be that first year, it may be a very cold winter, it may be a very warm summer, we don't know. There could be something very unusual in that year that means we have to take that first year with a pinch of salt. So it's, as we build up the observations, that's why we tend to go for, I think, a minimum of 3 years in this case.
Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. Just to pick up on some of the points that were being made there by Rhoda, and I think on the point that was made by Dr Needle about the policy of not putting people on one-man boats to gather data. I've certainly been on these boats, and I don't want to deal in anecdote, but like Rhoda, I'm not quite sure I understand how the supposed cod bycatch by creelers is being measured if people are not being sent out on one-man boats to measure it, and how you propose to get past that, because it certainly does seem, from my anecdotal knowledge, to be quite an unusual thing compared to in the Nephrops trawl sector.
Well, I would say in relation to that, and Kobe may want to add more information in relation to how we monitor that. Again, we'd be looking to utilise REM. We've used that in relation to the Solway fairly recently, and I think that's been quite successful in terms of having that equipment on vessels. But again, Kobe will have more information.
Yes, so what we have done in the Solway crab and lobster example is we've asked the fishermen to... It's a tablet with a camera, essentially, and the fisherman's asked to hold buried lobsters up, I think, buried lobsters, to the camera, and then they proceed like that. So, I mean, there's a number of different ways you could do it. If we were looking at cod bycatch specifically on a creeler, we could ask the fisherman to, all the cod he's taking out and putting back in the water, he could just hold it up to the camera. Or, in a more advanced version, he might have a length-based, a length board in front of the camera, so he'd just put it down on the length board before putting it back in the water. So we get, through this means, we'd get an estimate of the abundance and the propensity, I guess, of cod bycatch in creels, and you could go further and start to get an indication of length distributions as well. We would expect most cod to be caught in creels to be small, to be quite small, quite young fish, just because of the way the creel is set up. So that information would be important for the stock assessment model as well. So,
and I think it's important to emphasise again, coming back to the working group that's going to be overseeing this work as well, who I imagine would be feeding into that process, which will have fishermen as well as scientists represented on it.
Could I just sorry. Can I just add, just in addition to the technology, the remote electronic monitoring tablets that Kobe's referred to, which have been procured, they're ready to deploy. In addition to that, we'll be looking to deploy across the creel sector basic tracking devices, and again, that will help build up a picture of where the fleet are actually fishing, where that fishing is taking place.
Thank you. Excuse me, Cabinet Secretary, your letter states that reducing or eliminating cod from creels would have a positive impact on the health and sustainability of cod stocks. But surely that rationale should also apply to reducing or eliminating bycatch by Nephrop trawls. So why does SSI propose no measures to tackle that problem?
Again, when it comes to bycatch, that's part of the work that we're taking forward through the future catching policy and what we've been looking at there. But I think, again, coming back to the models that exist as well, I talked about not having any data from 2019, but I think it's fair to say there have been developments within that time as well in terms of selectivity improvements. So again, that's what the scientific programme is all about, discovering the actual extent of that, as well as us looking at other work to improve that. Sorry, Jim.
If I may, if I could add to that on the future catching policy work. So while the order's clearly Clyde-specific, the future catching policy is a key programme of work as part of our strategy. It's been undertaken in partnership with the fishing industry and other stakeholders over the last 18 months to 2 years. It takes a sector-by-sector approach, and obviously the one that's most relevant to the Clyde is the small inshore Nephrops fleet. We know relative, because of the research that's been undertaken pre-2020, that it's a relatively clean fishery. I think from the evidence that you heard a couple of weeks ago, figures of less or around 1% bycatch was quoted, and that's right. I think it's also important to emphasise that there has been improvements in selectivity since that period, technical improvements in selectivity of the Nephrop trawl fleet, and the future catching policy consultation will include recommendations for further improvements as well, which will improve selectivity and reduce discarding, we hope.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Just on that, it would be great to hear about the selectivity and the technology that you're looking at, and a bit more about the future catch policy, because I mean, I think that's the thing we've been kind of challenged, I think, with the stakeholders roundtable to develop smarter policy. You may have picked that up as well. So is clearly what you've just brought in is that this SSI is not sitting alone. There's other things, but it would be good to hear, because we've had people talking about Swedish mesh or something in a trawl net. And others saying that's not happening, and others saying there's all these things that are happening. So it'd be good to know what is actually happening in that space already and what you intend to bring in.
I think I'll probably hand over to my technical experts in relation to the specifics of that question as well. But just to say more detail, and I'm happy to write to the committee when the consultation launches on the future catching policy, because, as I say, that is meant to be next week or within the next couple of weeks, where all the more detailed information will be part of that. But again, I'll write and highlight that to the committee. So I don't know whether Kobe or Jim would want to come in relation to the technical specifics.
Yeah, so, yes, thank you for that question. Just on the trawl selectivity devices in particular, we have worked for a number of years with the industry and with our research vessels on devising methods for trying to eliminate fish from Nephrops trawls. And there's, you mentioned the Swedish grid is one method of doing this. It's a fairly rigid metal grid that tends to deflect fish away from the cod end and allows Nephrops to pass through. So that can be quite successful. What we found with our industry was they found it difficult to use. It was quite cumbersome, and there was health and safety issues with trying to get that back on board. So we have developed subsequently a sort of flexible plastic version of that that gets around some of these issues. I don't know the extent to which this is being used in the Clyde fleet specifically, but I agree that, you know, certainly since 2019, the information that we're getting is that selectivity, or the use of these methods or these devices, has increased within the sector. So I think, you know, once we get the assessment model up to date using the more recent data up to 2025, we might get a different impression of bycatch in that particular fleet as well. In terms of the creel selectivity issue, I already mentioned that we've got this Codscape project that we've started up, which is looking at, it's early days for that one, but it's looking at methods to basically looking at creel architecture that makes it less available to cod or less attractive to cod, so and other whitefish like haddock and whiting. So you want to try and devise a creel that is only really targeting the crab and lobsters that are trying to be caught. So that's some more work that we're putting towards this.
Yeah, if I could just may add, so I think you probably heard from the evidence session again that the nets that are used for the Neffrock trawl and the Clyde are designed not to catch fish. They don't want to catch fish. They've got very limited quota for any fish that they do catch, so that makes sense. The measures that were introduced 5 years ago to improve selectivity, such as the introduction of the square mesh panel, so again, depending on the size of the vessel, it's between 2 and 3 metres in length, it's 300 mil, so this is getting quite technical, but essentially any fish that come in, depending on the species, they'll tend to swim up, and they'll escape up through the square mesh panel on the net, allowing the Neffrocks to actually stay in. The future catching policy, as I said, specifically talking about that small vessel Neffrocks fleet, has been looking at a number of improvements, including increasing the mesh in the cod end, and also looking at changes to the square mesh panel, for example. So again, that's all subject to consultation, but that consultation has been informed by months and months of engagement with the fishing industry and other stakeholders.
Okay, I will move to a question from Evelyn Tweed.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. Thanks for your answers so far. Cabinet Secretary, I can see what the government's trying to do. It's trying to protect stocks, get a stronger evidence base, but it's just to clarify the process and some of the remarks that you've made today already. You've talked of an adaptive process and an annual progress report, which is welcome. So presumably, if the evidence changes along the way, the Scottish Government's approach will also change on an ongoing basis. You've said that that would be discussed with stakeholders. You've said it would be discussed with the committee. You've said the government will be listening. Crucially, I think there will be no surprises if this process works in the way that the government intends. And also that, although it's a 3-year SSI, it's not set in stone. This will be an ongoing process that will be discussed with everyone along the way. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it might be helpful, I might hand over to Jim in a moment, I think, just to talk about some of the engagement that's taken place so far, I think, in terms of that engagement with industry, as well as with our higher education institutions, as well in, I think, developing some of the work that we're taking forward. But I think you're absolutely right, because I know that that's been some of the criticism has been about the period of the closure, the fact that this is a 3-year SSI. Previously, of course, it's been for 2 years. But again, for the rationale that COBE has set out for the period that he believes is needed and that's recommended, I think, to build that scientific picture. But again, I have to emphasise it isn't a case of hitting pause over that time. I think we know the evidence gaps. The scientific programme has been developed around helping us try and fill those gaps. Again, should there be any need to change or adapt that closure as I set out to Rhoda Grant, then, and that meant we had to bring forward another order, that's absolutely what we would do within that time if we develop that picture. But again, we are continuing to work closely with industry as well. I've touched on a few times today about the working group that's going to be overseeing this programme of work too, which I think is really critical, because we need to be working closely with the fishing industry themselves, as well as with scientific advisors and policy within the Marine Directorate. So I think it is going to be a very collaborative piece of work, should it be approved by the Parliament, of course. But I'll hand over to Jim, who'll be able to say a bit more about some of that engagement that's taken place.
Yeah, sure. I probably won't elaborate too much more on the working group itself, but perhaps just to emphasise some of the discussions that have taken place with stakeholders over the last few months. With regards to the fishing industry, we've had lots of really positive discussions with the Clyde Fishermen's Association in particular, but with others. I've also engaged with colleagues in Northern Ireland, for example, who've got an interest in the fishery. The discussions with the Clyde Fishermen's Association in particular have centred around the implementation of the science programme. What will be the conditions around access, for example, to the closed area? So, as I said, they've been really productive. I think we're really quite pleased with how they have gone. And I know that the creel fishers, and it's not just the association representatives, it's been individual fishermen we've been sitting down with discussing. They've been reassured, and in some cases I think it's fair to say relieved with what they've been told around those access arrangements and the type of work that we'll be doing in partnership with them.
Can I also, from the evidence that we took, it was quite clear that the fishing industry wants to be involved in those conversations. They want to know what the science is saying so that they can think about their businesses, how they do things in the future. And I think that's really important. Cabinet Secretary, do you know just now what the annual progress report to committee might look like? Do you know just now what that's going to include?
Well, first of all, I think on your first point, I think the fishing industry have got to be an integral partner of this work, and that's why I welcome that we're working closely alongside it. In terms of the annual report, it's not possible for me to set out right now exactly what that is going to look out, but I think in terms of what we set out that we're looking to do through the scientific programme, I would expect that we would be reporting against how that work is progressing in each of those phases and at what stage that work is at and evidence we found to date in relation to that as we're providing those progress updates. And if then if that means that we are going to then see any changes, and of course there will be, as we've talked about a few times today, the future catching policy, again we'll be consulting on that. That will take a few months to go through, as well as a period of time to look to implement that afterwards as well, so that there will be more progress on that, again, that we can update on within that annual report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
I know this has been covered before, Cabinet Secretary, but if I could just come back to the spawning disturbance, can you just highlight again what Clyde-specific evidence supports the spawning disturbance rationale, which is being used to remove exemptions for quills, and if none, why retain that prohibition?
Again, I think I've been quite clear in the committee, and I've set it out in the letter. I've set it out verbatim, and I've repeated it already today. We've said that there is no direct evidence from the Clyde that demonstrates that. We don't have direct evidence showing that fishing activity is disturbing spawning cod, but we also don't have evidence that shows that it doesn't disturb spawning activity. So again, we recognise the issues and from some of the observations that we've seen as well. Again, as I've set out in the letter, we've found actively spawning cod out with that closed area, which suggests that it's something that we need to look at. Now, spawning closures aren't rare. We use them in other areas, such as through the North Sea cod avoidance plan as well. So again, it can be an important measure that we look at. But all of what we've set out through the closure, through the scientific programme, is about filling those evidence gaps.
Okay.
I still can't get my head round a policy based on no evidence one way or t'other. And I know we're not going to revisit that. We've done it to death, but it seems very strange that even in the precautionary principle, there is no evidence whatsoever that disturbance actually reduces spawning. And in fact, the spawning is not the issue here. But we'll move on. Question from Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. We've touched on this already about working with the other fisher folks out there, and I'm interested in how you plan to embed co-design and transparency with the local fishers. We heard from one of the fishermen last week, Sean McElwraith, about his experience, but I'm interested in how we plan to build trust and enhance trust with the fishermen so that we can help look at the whole process. I
would hope that we've been able to do that through the work that Jim has outlined, and I think that very much collaborative piece around the scientific programme. Ultimately, we can't do this without the fishing industry being involved. Now, I absolutely recognise the impact that the closure has caused and the impact that that's had on some businesses and fishermen as well. And obviously, I think it was really difficult to hear some of the evidence that the committee heard in previous weeks about the impact of that on some fishermen. But again, I think that's why the work that we're developing in partnership with them is so important in moving forward, because I think when everyone is a part of that process, hopefully we will all see the value in it. We recognise the evidence gaps that exist, and that's what this programme is about filling those and ensuring that any management measures that we impose in coming years are done based on the best available evidence.
We heard also from Elaine Wiley last week that she's totally open to engaging and working with you all. Is that something that you're obviously you'll welcome that. Can you speak a wee bit about that?
Absolutely. Jim will probably be able to say a bit more about that as well, because Jim's been engaging quite closely, I think, with Elaine, as with other individual fishermen as well. Sorry, Jim.
Yes, of course. And yeah, we've got a really good, strong working relationship with the Clyde Fishermen's Association, as indeed we do with almost all fishing associations around the coast of Scotland. That doesn't happen overnight. That happens because you go out and you speak to the individuals and the association representatives in their patch as well. In terms of rebuilding trust, I think it's about those relationships, but it's about being able to explain the rationale for the measures that are being proposed, and then at a more practical level about the implementation and just how they will be engaged during that process and during the 3 years. I think it's important to emphasise as well is that, and you got this I know from the session last week, is just the breadth of views that exist out there. I describe them as the polarised views that exist, and it is a highly charged topic for sure. So it's important that we do put that legwork in on the ground and sit down and engage with both the associations and the individuals, and that's what we've done, and that's what we'll continue to do, primarily through the working group that's been mentioned already.
Just on that point, working with the industry is clearly critical, I think, to the success of this initiative. There's a number of things we can do ourselves in the Marine Directorate. We can put in additional survey stations in the Clyde, which we're planning to do next month, actually, already. We can update the historical assessment data going into the historical assessment and bring that up to date. So these are things that we can do ourselves. But in terms of evaluating the presence or absence, as the case may be, of bycatch across fleet sectors, clearly we need the input and the collaboration with the industry in order to be able to achieve that. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere. And I think if the bycatch question is such a critical one that if we don't have the help of the industry in that particular aspect, we probably won't get much further forward. So that's something we have to work very closely with them on. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
Thank you. So we've touched, I think Beatrice Wishart actually earlier on touched on the biannual closures as opposed to the 3 years that's been suggested here. And I just wanted to come back on that because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're saying is effectively that 3 years of data is worthwhile having, and that's why you've suggested the 3 years here. But beyond that, is there any other sort of evidence that demonstrates, beyond just the need for that data, why the 3 years is necessary?
Again, we proposed a 3-year scientific programme on advice from my scientific advisors about the time that would be needed to build that fuller picture. But again, it's a 3-year SSI isn't a commitment to a static closure. It's just about keeping those protections in place and providing that stability while we're building that evidence base. But again, Kobe, I don't know if there's more you would want to add to that.
I think let's say in the first year we'll start to get an idea of what we're looking at in terms of bycatch, spawning locations, juvenile areas as well, and all the kind of stuff that we're trying to measure. We'll get an idea in that first year, but I think it would probably be premature to jump at that, as it were, and to do too much with that initially. I think into the second year you start to build up a stronger picture of what the evidence base is telling you, and then into the third year you have a more clear idea. But that's not to say that within, after that first year we can't start considering at least whether the information is strong enough in order to be able to move forward with alternatives, I think. I guess
what I'm trying to drive at here, is there is no outcome particularly you're looking for at the end of those 3 years. This is all being driven by that underpinning science programme for you. In terms of that so there's not an outcome at the end of those 3 years. It's just that science programme will define what happens moving forward. Does that make sense?
It's helping to fill the evidence gaps that we know exist, as an example, through that model, so that we are basing any decisions from that point on the best available evidence.
Okay, I think that's fine then.
Okay. Do we need legislation to allow this to go ahead, the TSP to go ahead? Because we've already heard great examples of Marine Directorate working with stakeholders in the Solway, putting remote electronic monitoring and cameras, whatever, to record buried hen lobsters and so on. And that's been done in close collaboration and welcomed by the industry. So it looks like that the only reason, well, I'll ask the first question, why do we need legislation to allow this TSP to go ahead?
Well, you don't need the legislation to allow the TSP to go ahead. It's not part of the order, but the two work in parallel.
Well, it kind of is. It is part of the SSI, but it looks to me the only reason it needs to be in the legislation is because you're bringing in a closure. So it's to allow TSP to be carried out during a closure. So if you don't have the closure, you don't actually need any other legislation to allow this scientific data collection to take place.
But then the area is generally open to fishing. So it's, without having the closure in place, we're losing even that I think that minimum protection for cod during that time, at a time when we know that the stock is under pressure. But
this is the point we're arguing, that it only protects, it's only in place to protect spawning, which the evidence suggests there's not an issue with. So my question is, do you need legislation? Because one of the driving factors behind this, one of the arguments in favour of this SSI is it will give us this fantastic opportunity to collect data for 3 years. But actually, you don't need legislation to do that, because there's great examples of Marine Directorate and stakeholders working together collaboratively to look at a sustainable fishery. So you don't actually need the legislation to do it. The only reason you do is because you need to be able to do it to allow people to fish within the closed area.
Sorry, Jim, do you want to go on this?
Yeah, I think in addition to the closed area, so both the science programme and the order working in parallel, supporting each other, and we've already talked about the adaptive approach here. One thing that I might suggest has been lost here is that as part of the wider package, we're also restricting access to the wider Clyde. So there'll be, and this is with reference to that track record. So if you've not fished during the period 23 through to 25, you won't be able to have access to the wider Clyde, not the specific closed area that we've been talking about for much of this morning, but the wider Clyde. And that's really important in that it will protect and provide a degree of protection, to the actual science programme itself. It will stop any potential influx of visiting vessels coming in. And it will help provide that stability during the period. And we've talked quite a bit about the importance of protecting spawning, but from new evidence that's come along from the consultation as well, there's been a clear shift towards measures to reduce bycatch and fisher mortality, for example, and putting in place that type of protection will be one big step to help achieve that.
Okay, thank you. Question from Ariane, beg your pardon, supplementary, Emma Harper.
Just to come back in quickly, I said Elaine Wiley before, I meant Elaine White, so I just want to correct the record.
Okay, thanks. Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Continuing questions around the targeted scientific programme. So it's good to hear that you could still do the scientific programme without this SSI necessarily being
potentially we need to buy it.
Agreed. But I'd be interested to understand, so in 2024, you committed to an enhanced science plan for the Clyde to improve scientific observations. And now we've got this TSP. I'd be interested to understand why, after repeated scientific initiatives, you're not actually in a position to consider alternative approaches, and when would that position change? It just feels like, from what we've been talking about this morning, not really confident that we're actually getting the picture when everything points back to the problem really being a significant amount of bycatch from the Nephrops trawl that is creating the high fishing mortality, and that's that's the alarm that is being raised here. A high fishing mortality that would be expected to remove around 80% of the biomass each year. So it just seems to me that what you're putting in place, we've kind of already got the data. We heard that from the evidence we heard from the roundtable, from the scientists, and here we are saying, oh, now we've got to look at more scientific evidence from Creelers and look at their bycatch, and yet alarm bells are alarmingly being sounded around an emergency situation with this massive reduction in biomass. So if you tell me a little bit about the 2024 science, what did you do, what data was gathered, what changed, and then therefore why do we need the TSP because something wasn't delivered? That would be a helpful start.
In there that we'll try and cover and try and address, because I think, well, because one key important point is you talk about the crisis and the situation that we're fishing and trying to address the pressures of that. But again, one key point is if this order is annulled, then there are no protections in place and the area will be open to fishing. But I think in relation to what's been found, and I think obviously the Strathclyde model is critical to that, but again, there are limitations in that work and uncertainties that mean that we have to be really cautious when we're applying that to the management decisions that we make. As I've touched on earlier, there isn't the historical data prior to 2002 because a lot of that hasn't been digitised. That's part of the scientific programme work, is about digitising that information. There isn't the data beyond 2019. So that we don't have, it hasn't been updated with the information over the course of the past 7 years. There's the lack of data on the creel bycatch, and on top of all that, it doesn't take into account then, because we haven't collected that data for the past 7 years, the impact of any potential of the closures and the orders that we've had in place in that time. And that's why the programme of work that's been set out is about addressing those measures. And again, it's also about highlighting, again, we've talked about the issues and potentially with disturbance. Have we got that in the right place? And again, that's what the work is really designed to do, is to look at that in closer detail. I'll hand over to Kobe, who'll be able to provide more information specifically in relation to that. But again, there's also the other pieces of work that we are doing to tackle those bycatch issues. There have been improvements within that 7-year period, where we'll be looking at consulting on the future catching policy, which is about those selectivity improvements as well. But I think it's really important to bear all of that in mind.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so since 2024, since we last had this discussion, so the surveys in Q1 and Q4 have proceeded as planned on the Scotia. Those have been obviously out with the closed area in Q1 in particular, because Scotia wasn't allowed in, as no one was. So we had between 3 and 4 stations, depending on the weather, in that area in the Clyde. Every year since 2024, and we're now proposing to extend that to 12 altogether in the Clyde, so increasing the density of survey stations by 3 times, essentially, which is will improve the information going into the stock assessment model. We've also been able to, post-COVID actually, we've been able to send observers on the NEFROP's trawl fleet, less than we would like, but that for a number of different reasons, but that's something we're trying to reinvigorate as well. It's worth mentioning we did, science doesn't always succeed, we did passive acoustic monitoring using 2 or 3 of these PAM devices in the Clyde. They're really there. One of them was there in particular to test for marine mammals in South Arran MPA. But we used a couple more to determine if you could hear when male cod are spawning or when they're mating, they produce grunting noises, and you can hear this apparently. But the radius of detection of these monitors was too small to enable us to actually hear anything. So that was a bit of a fail, but we did try. And then, of course, we've had the Strathclyde assessment model has been published now. So previously, when we met, it had not been published, and the thesis hadn't been examined, I don't think. So that was in development still, but we now have that. And I think that what's interesting from that is you were talking there about the clear conclusion from that work is the sort of I suppose, the blame or the driver of the high fish mortality is the Nephrops trawl fleet. And I think it's a kind of circular argument, because that assessment model, excellent though it is, it only includes, for recent years, bycatch data from the Nephrops trawl fleet, because they didn't have access to bycatch data from the creel fleet, because we don't have any. So that's fair, that's why they did that. But I think to only put in bycatch information from trawlers and then conclude that the only way to improve fishing mortality on the stock is to penalise the trawlers is a bit of a circular argument that I don't think is necessarily fair or proportionate across the fleet sectors. So I think that's something that's part of what we're trying to deal with the creel bycatch, is to address that issue, if it is an issue.
But I mean, everything, all the evidence that we've had says that the bycatch from Nephrops trawlers is the problem. It's an alarm bell ringing problem. And it feels to me that this SSI is then going, oh, but let's look over here and look at creelers. And I feel like I don't know whether it was you or Jim, but in another session I was talking about trawlers and the conversation ends up going back to creelers. And I think, okay, I hear your point. You want to look at what the bycatch is in the creel situation, but I can imagine that it is, and from that data, it's going to be a very small amount. So you're busy putting time and effort to look at the bycatch from creel, and meanwhile there's this alarm bell ringing situation that is saying this is the problem. And yes, there's going to be future catching policies and things that come in and a kind of a bigger context and picture, but it seems, and as the convener asked, potentially you can do this TSP without having this SSI in place.
First of all, if I can say, this isn't about focusing on one sector over the other. It's about actually just getting a complete picture of what's going on. So this isn't a case of only doing work on creels where we don't have that information. It's also a case of the observers on the trawlers to see what's happening too. So this is a piece of work in the round, looking at what is going on in that area across all fleet segments. So it's not a case of picking on one or the other, but if we want to have an up-to-date model based on the most up-to-date information and have that complete picture, these are the evidence gaps that we need to fill.
Okay, but it feels to me like there's a focus now on creelers, and yet what we know is that from the mid-1980s, around 1,000 tonnes, we've seen a decline in cod stocks from around 1,000 tonnes to now only 20 tonnes in 2019, and that's an alarm bell. That's ringing there, and that is connected to bycatch from the Nephrops trawl.
Again, I would probably disagree with that, and I think your first statement there, purely because this isn't about a focus on the creelers. We're focusing on creelers and trawlers through the science programme, again, to fill those evidence gaps. It's about trying to get that complete picture across the piece. It's not focusing more on one over the other, because we need to fill those evidence gaps.
Yeah.
And sorry, Kobe.
So, and I think, I'll say again, I think the conclusion that the high fishing mortality is due to Nephrops trawlers is a function of the assessment model only using bycatch information from the Nephrops trawlers. Now, it may be that we see in, as I say, this sort of more anecdotal information or video-based information that we have, we do see cod being caught in creels as bycatch. But it may be that in the Clyde that's not an issue, and then we can have this discussion again. If the point is, I would hesitate to recommend reaching that conclusion without an awareness and a knowledge and an estimate, actually, of what the creel bycatch is. Because if it's significant and we only enact management measures against one or for one specific fleet sector, say there's significant bycatch of cod in creels, let's just hypothesise that for a second, then if you only manage the Nephrops trawl sector, firstly, that's not fair, it's not proportionate, and also it might not achieve the mortality reduction that you're seeking if cod is still being caught in creels. Now, we may be wrong in that. It may be that they're not being caught in creels, but we need to have that evidence in order to reach that conclusion, in order to have management, as I say, that's fair and proportionate. Otherwise, you're just guessing, I think.
Okay, I mean, Okay, just thinking this through a little bit, and I want to thank the Shetland Fishermen's Association for educating me on the different gears, because they've got a wonderful annual handbook that shows you all the pictures. So just in my mind, I think if you have a big net that's moving across the surface of the sea, you're going to surely catch a lot more bycatch cod, juvenile, than you are if you put a pot down and it's sitting quietly on the surface of this seabed.
But the thing about a pot or a creel is it's baited, so it has a radius of attraction, we say. So it brings in fish. It brings in crabs and lobsters and nephrops, which is what they're actually trying to catch. But it can also bring in fish, including cod, from the neighbouring location.
But I still think that the amount of area that you can cover trawling with a net on a regular basis than pots sitting on the ground is going to be, you're going to cover a lot more space and then therefore catch up many more
maybe
bycatch.
But you could also say that fish are able to some extent swim away from trawls. They can get out the way sometimes. Creels have this attractive quality because they're baited, and there can be quite a lot of creels in the water at any one time. Jim knows more about that than I do.
If I may, if I could just go back to one point I made earlier, is that the gear that's currently being used in the Clyde through the Nephrop trawl fleet is designed not to catch fish, because they don't want to catch it. It's a relatively clean fishery. We've got a relatively small number of vessels that are working in that area, both creel and trawl, actually. We estimate there's around 3,500, just in the closed area, around 3,500 creels that are normally worked in that area. Now, they're working all the time. So they're fishing all the time, as Kobe said, that they're baited. So it's important that we compare that with a sweep, a trawl from a number of vessels, mobile vessels that are working in that area. If I may just come back and emphasise the point that the science programme is looking at both the trawl fleet and the creel fleet. For the Nephrop trawl fleet, it's important that we incorporate more up-to-date information in terms of the bycatch and incorporate the new gear that these vessels have been using for the last 5 or 6 years and bring that more up to date. So.
Okay, I mean, I find that
we have to move on. I've got a supplementary from Beatrice Wishart.
Yeah, just for clarification, are you saying the science programme is focusing on bycatch rather than actual seabed disturbance?
It's broader, yes. It'll be you're looking at bycatch in both the Nephrop trawl and also the static fleet as well. Yeah.
But there's been an emphasis on disturbance in the seabed in terms of spawning. So where does that feature?
And the science, yeah. I mean, Kobe might want to come in on that as well.
The bycatch is one issue. Location of spawning animals is another. Location of spawners and juveniles. So we want to have more finely distinguished, I guess, spatial impressions of where cod are spawning in the Clyde, so that we, if we do have closures to try and protect spawning fish or to try and prevent disturbance of spawning fish, then they're more finely targeted to where the fish are actually doing that activity. So that's another part of the TSP. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Rhoda Grant.
We know that the the targeted scientific programme doesn't need the SSI to happen, but yet it's being presented as justification for extending the closure. But it doesn't even examine the effectiveness of the measures implemented through the SSI. And we have heard there is no evidence whatsoever that the measures are effective. So why should we be supporting this going forward, given the financial and social impact?
Again, I fully recognise the impact of the closure, and for us it's about maintaining at least that protection that exists through the closure for cod. It's also, when you look at the targeted scientific programme and the key aims of that, as Kobe was just outlining to Beatrice Wishart, Ultimately, that's about improving the estimation of bycatch mortality, looking at the fleet dynamics. It's also about improving that estimation of the spawning and juvenile distributions across that area as well, so that we can ultimately make sure that any potential closures or management measures we're putting in place are in the right places, and again we're filling those evidence gaps so that we have an up-to-date, the model is running with the most up-to-date information that we have available. But I do think it's important that we can't just open up the area again. I think we need to be able to maintain that closure, because again I think that's the precautionary and the proportionate measure to take.
But it has had no impact. It seems to me that we should have been carrying out the science long before now, but keeping in place measures that are having a financial and social impact as justification for that just simply doesn't work. Probably there's not an answer to that, but...
Well, I would say on some of that, though, scientific work has been done on the background, and I think Kobe outlined some of that, and unfortunately some of it just didn't work. We didn't get that information, or it didn't work in the way that we might have anticipated or expected that it would. Also, within the time since the last order, that's when we had the publishing of the Strathclyde model of assessment. So again, which is really a helpful move forward, but all we're seeing is it has uncertainties around it, and we need to make sure that we're using the most up-to-date information, and we're filling the gaps that we know exist as part of that model, which is why the work that we've set out is so important.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks very much. Just listening to everything this morning about, back and forward about what we need to do in terms of scientific research and continued engagement with all the people on the water. I'm just wondering, what are the consequences of not moving this SSI?
Again, if the SSI is annulled, then the area would be open to fisheries. We wouldn't have a closed area. And I think that would be a concern, I think, given what we know about the condition of the stock.
And the closed area is allowing for research to still take place by some vessels?
There would be limited activity through the scientific programme, so there would be some access to allow some of the scientific work to take place. Yeah, sorry, Jim.
Yeah, and just to add to that, if we didn't have any measures in place, then given the health of the stock, we would be acting at odds with the objectives and our obligations under the UK Fisheries Act.
Which is about protecting stock and making sure that we have sustainable fisheries.
Yeah, there are a number of different objectives within the Fisheries Act about, the precautionary objective, scientific objective, sustainability objective, again, that we have to try and meet. But we're also trying to balance that with the socio-economic considerations and the wider impacts that Rhoda Grant touched on there as well.
Okay, thanks.
But the closure's based on disturbance.
Again, I've outlined all of this in the letter to committee. Now, we've said that, again, that we're basing it on the evidence that we'd presented in previous orders, but we recognise that what we've observed in that time questions the hypothesis that we'd based that on, again, which is why the scientific work is so important, because it's about filling those evidence gaps, as well as looking at the wider bycatch issues and doing that across the whole fleet.
Okay, thank you. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. I suppose it returns to this issue of the next 3 years, and just to get a picture of how Parliament would have a role over the next 3 years in assessing any new data that came the government's way and assessing the effectiveness of the measures.
Again, one thing that we'd be keen to do is keep the committee updated on the work, because I obviously appreciate how much interest there is in this order, and I think given the broader impacts and the views that the committee's heard from a wide range of stakeholders too. So I committed in my opening comments to providing the committee with an annual update on that, but of course I would be keeping the committee updated on other pieces of work that we're doing that could potentially impact this work. We've touched on the future catching policy today, so again I'd be looking to keep the committee updated in relation to that. And clearly, if evidence emerged through that 3-year period where we needed to adapt a closure, it was clear that was something that we needed to do, and adapt the area or make any significant changes that would mean that another instrument would be brought forward, then of course that's what we would do.
And would there be, you mentioned that possibility, but would there be powers available to you to make changes in light of such data without returning to Parliament for new legislation?
I don't think that there would be, in terms of if we were changing the area to be closed. But again, Jim, I don't know if you'd have further information on that.
I mean, there's different measures that we could use. We regularly use what's called licensing conditions, and that's a route that we could certainly use, depending on, of course, the information that comes through, any new data that is provided, and that will be done in discussion primarily with the working group.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
Thank you very much. This is question 10 you want me to move on to. Yes, so we're moving on to socio-economic impacts. And I just wanted to touch on, as much as I love all the various stakeholders we see in front of this committee, there's always something quite compelling, I think, when you have people in that don't maybe always sort of join in with the parliamentary process. And so the two fishermen that the Clyde Fishermen's Association brought in were quite important, I think, last week when we went through, not last week, the week before last, when we went through that. And actually, I guess the question I want to ask is, when looking at the BRIA, it seems to suggest, and I've got it in front of me here, that krill vessels may lose up to 26% of their annual profits, net props trawlers up to 49%. So what assessment, I guess, has the government made of that, and how do you consider that proportionate?
Well, again, you can see all the assessments set out in the BRIA and the information there as to how we've considered that against the different options that we've considered as part of that work. I read back the evidence that the committee had heard. I hear that directly from fishermen themselves as well. Of course, it is really hard to hear that because, of course, any decision that we take has real-world consequences. There's no getting away from that. But I think, obviously, what we're trying to do as well is balance all of that against the legal obligations that we have to satisfy. And we have to take all of that into consideration when we're bringing forward, whether it's this SSI or other decisions that we make across government. Of course, we want to try and minimise any economic impact where that's possible. That's not always possible because, again, we have to make sure we're meeting our legal obligations. And, again, we've set out the information in the BRIA as to the impact of that. And you've heard it directly from the fishermen themselves, and I think as well as from Elaine White, who quantified what that was meaning for the vessels. Because I think while it has been possible in previous years for, say, some vessels to move elsewhere, we know that hasn't been the case for everyone. And we also know that's getting increasingly difficult anyway, purely because of other things like increases in fuel costs and such like. So again, we always we take all of these factors into consideration, and ultimately we try and reach that balance as best we can.
And obviously, in this case, you have looked at that and said, well, this is proportionate, what we're doing. But I guess the frustration for many of us around this table, I think, and definitely when you look at the consultation responses, is that this isn't proportionate, this isn't balanced. Because after 20 years, you've got two fishermen sitting in this room actually quite just upset about what's happened to their communities. And actually, they might feel differently if they felt there had been an outcome. But they don't feel that. They feel that their communities have been harmed. And here we are now facing a 3-year potential extension to that closure. Nobody really knows what's happening with that. And there's some groups that are sort of saying, well, maybe we should do it because what happens if, ENGOs come in and try and blow this up into something bigger? I'm not suggesting they would, but if that did, and they're scared about it getting even worse, and others saying, look, don't go ahead with this. This is madness. We don't know what we're doing here. But actually, in all of that, despite all of your consultation responses, which I'm sure you've read, you still think this is proportionate response?
There's a few important factors and issues that you've touched on there that I want to try and come on to. Again, I think what has been important and what is important about part of the work that we'll be taking forward through this order in the SSI is the scientific programme, and I think directly engaging with industry so that all of us, hopefully, a few years down the line, are in a clearer position as to what is the situation. We've got the most up-to-date science, we've filled those evidence gaps, and we have a clearer picture of how we need to best manage that area of the Clyde for the recovery of cod, which scientific advisors believe is entirely possible. So I think working with the industry closely on that. And again, we need that collaboration for the work to move forward. Again, it comes back to that balance that we are trying to strike. We have legal obligations. If we know a stock is in trouble, then we need to try and take action to prevent that. We're legally obligated to. and it's trying to balance that against all these other factors which are set out in the Fisheries Act and about that socio-economic impact too. We're very cognisant of that. So again, I believe the position that we've set out will help us move forward in a positive and constructive way, help us to fill those evidence gaps that we know exist so that everybody is sitting around this table with a clearer picture of exactly what the situation is and how we can best move forward and make progress.
Okay. Can I just ask one quick question? Just on the back of Emma Harper's a moment ago, we talked about what would happen potentially if this SSI is annulled today and therefore it didn't move forward. Am I right in thinking originally this was a voluntary scheme anyway, wasn't it? So there is a potential that, were this not to move forward today, there is still some work that could be done there with the local fishermen to look at immediate works, potential or a voluntary closure, while you move forward with creating a new SSI and a new programme that actually might get a better consultation response.
A voluntary closure would mean that we weren't meeting our legal obligations in terms of the Fisheries Act. And also, I think what you've touched on is another really important point there in the consultation, because I think the committee's heard a lot of evidence. We've obviously seen the views that were expressed through the consultation. A lot of that is mixed. What we're not clear on is, I don't think there's any shared view of what any alternative would look like. And I appreciate we're in a black or white situation. If the order proceeds, of course, as set out, we've set out what would happen. If it is annulled, it ultimately opens the area to fishing. And that's the situation that we would be in. We wouldn't have a closed area in a place where we know the stock is in trouble. So again, that's why I think we have to take the precautionary approach that we've set out, and I would hope that committee would be supportive of that, because I think if there are alternative suggestions, I'm more than happy to hear them. But again, from what I can see, the evidence is so mixed, it is, and they're very polarised views in relation to this. It's what any next steps would be that would be really difficult.
Okay, thank you.
Can you set out why you would be meeting the fisheries objectives under Fisheries Act 2020, Section 1 that you've just touched on?
Because we'd pretty much be saying that we know a stock is in trouble and we'd be failing to take any action to remedy that.
But the objectives require fisheries must be managed so stocks are restored and maintained at sustainable levels. But this SSI doesn't materially reduce the main source of fishing, mortality on cod, or introduce any bycatch reduction measures. So it doesn't actually do anything to meet those objectives.
I believe it does. And I'm happy to set that out in more detail to committee, but I think it meets the sustainability objective, precautionary objective, scientific, ecosystem and bycatch objectives.
But it doesn't, because it doesn't introduce any bycatch reduction measures. And again, the closure is based on disturbance or spawning, of which there is no evidence at all. So you couldn't be challenged under that.
But if you look at the sustainability objective as an example, so we know that the stock's at a low level, that cod mortality is too high, and if you were to remove any protections from that, it's going to do nothing to mitigate it. So the seasonal closure at least offers some protection while we're working towards that longer-term recovery.
But you can't set out what that protection is. That's the problem, what benefits it would bring.
Because you've not got the fishing pressure there in the same way.
Okay. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. Just on the back of the original question from Tim Eagle, we did hear witnesses report that vessel sales and businesses were closing and there was reduced harbour activity in Maidens and Girvan and also in Campbelltown. And I know we think about depopulation, we think about challenges in rural communities, and you've kind of touched on it already about how we support engagement to have a balance to support rural communities. Is that something that you would work with directly with folks in Girvan, Maidens and Campbelltown?
Again, we're conscious of all of this. I mean, I don't think any of us around this table come into this job to try and make anybody's life worse. I think, regardless of our political perspectives, we're trying to improve things for people more generally. I completely understand, you've heard directly, I've heard it directly as well, about the impact that the closure has had. And as I say, the measures that we've introduced are all about trying to strike that balance. I very much bearing in mind the impact that this can have in broader communities. I do think it's important to recognise that there are also other issues more broadly that can be impacting our fishing industry. Again, I touched on fuel costs earlier. We know that there's shortages in who they can get to work on vessels as well, and that can be a significant factor. But again, I recognise that the closure is part of that too. So all I would emphasise is that and never take, whether it's this decision or any decision I have to make in my role as a minister, lightly, because we do know that our decisions have impacts more broadly, and it's about how we strike that balance while meeting our legal objectives, which is why we've set this order out in the way that we have, and we're proposing the measures that we are.
And if a new SSI was to be prepared, that's not going to happen in the remainder of this parliamentary session, is it?
We couldn't do that. I mean, first of all, we'd go back to the question of what is an alternative. I don't know what any alternative would be. When you look at the work that's gone into preparing this order, the consultation, we need to do the impact assessments. It's simply not possible for me to do that work and to bring that back.
Okay, thanks.
Rhoda Grant.
You've heard that the committee have listened to personal testimony from people about the impact of the closure, the personal impact, the deteriorating mental health, the boats being put out of business. And you must accept, I mean, given we have no evidence whatsoever that this SSI will make any difference. In fact, this is not the first time we've had this SSI come before us and be contested. There has been time to do the science, but yet there is not a jot of evidence that it'll make the blind bit of difference to anything that's going on. And given the distress it causes, you know, how are those effects being looked at? How are we gauging the well-being effects? How are we gauging the financial effects for little or no progress in protecting the fish stocks? And I guess also, just from what we heard previously, there are single-handed fishers working in this area, and yet we've been told that they can't be involved in the scientific project. So they're going to have to stop work while this continues, and stop work for no good reason. So really, how do you support them
Sorry,
if this SSI goes through?
Sorry, I think first of all on the point about the single-handed vessels, I would say that they would be able to take part because we have the mechanisms to be able to do that. So while we can't get the observers on board, there is the REM there, which is about being able to ensure that they can take part on that. So I would say that's not the case. And again, I would just emphasise the points I've made previously. I absolutely appreciate the impact that this has had on people. You've heard it directly, I've heard it as well, and officials through the engagement that we've undertaken. And we also try and gather that impact as best we can through the consultation that we undertake on measures, as well as through the impact assessments that we undertake. So we're very cognisant of that. But again, all of this is about the balance through the legal obligations that we have to meet, as well as considering those wider impacts, especially the social and economic impacts that has on our fishermen too.
I mean, it is incredibly concerning because we don't think this is going to make a jot of difference. The cost of REM, will that be met under the scientific trial, or does that fall to the boats themselves?
We'll be providing that equipment, so that won't fall to the vessels themselves to pay for.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Yeah, Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. So I heard your point in response to one of my colleagues around you can't bring back an SSI immediately, but I understand from what you're talking about, the legal obligations will require whoever is in post after the election to actually really address this quite urgently and find a different solution, a better solution that actually addresses the bycatch. I think that's really the issue that's been, I think, held up to us very brightly in the evidence sessions and all the letters we get. It's really the bycatch, and it's from the Nefrots trawl. So I just want to get clarity on that the legal constraints that the government sits within means that something will have to be done starting on whatever it is, the 10th or 11th of May of this year in order to address it. This can't just, if this was annulled, you can't just let it drop. You actually have to do something.
Well, again, the closure period would have passed because the closure is meant to start on at the end of this week. Again, I would have to take further advice on what that would look like. But again, that would mean that the area is ultimately open to fishing. And again, you talk about the bycatch, and I know that we discussed this earlier. But again, we don't have the most up-to-date information there, and we need to look at the fleet as a whole. So again, we recognise that that is a really good model, but there are uncertainties in it, and that's why we need the scientific programme. We need to do the work to be able to fill those gaps, so that we're basing decisions from here on in on the best available evidence.
If this SSI was annulled, you're saying that then there's fishing will happen. Could that be an opportunity to use the TSP in that process anyway? You've already got it all thought through and planned, and actually look at what happens with fishing happening, and that could be a starting point. For
again, that would be done on that would be entirely voluntary. So whether we could get everyone to agree on that basis, I don't know. But as I was outlining to Tim Eagle earlier, some voluntary measures may not be enough for us to satisfy our legal obligations in that regard.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
I just want to come back on, and just to help me to pick this up right. My understanding, because we've got quite a lot of papers in front of us from some of the experts that are really questioning a lot about this SSI, really fall into the other things we've heard from various different stakeholders. So my understanding is the cod stock here isn't particularly significant in terms of other cod stocks. Is that your understanding?
Sorry, in terms of the overall...
In terms of cod stocks in other allocations, yeah.
Kobe?
How are you defining significant?
Well, that's a very good question. How am I defining significant? I guess what I'm trying to get is the prawns here are very significant, aren't they? Why are we putting in place measures that affect that industry? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm coming across it yet.
So when the original stock identification or stock ID work that was done by ISIS in 2022, I think, in terms of the separation between the West Coast and the North Sea, the West Coast part of that concluded that there was strong evidence that the cod Clyde stock was genetically, or certainly functionally distinct. And I think Professor Heath, when he was at the stakeholder session here, he said any tagging data that's been done in the Clyde, those fish tagged in the Clyde will be cod in the Clyde. They don't go somewhere else, and you don't tend to get cod coming from outside into the Clyde. So it's a discrete, isolated population. Now, whether, I don't know, is it a societal decision whether that's worth maintaining? I think it is. I would argue that it's a population that's been there for thousands of years. It's a unique population of cod. I take your point that commercially nephrops would be more important than cod in that area, but I don't think that means that we don't have an obligation to try and protect that cod stock.
And I guess I'm not suggesting that is exactly my view. I guess I'm more questioning whether you have a sustainable fishing industry in that area, which is very important, and you have measures that have been in place for nearly 2 decades that haven't really worked at all, and you've got a lot of people questioning the SSI in front of us. And I guess I just wanted to finally understand why then are we persisting in this way?
Well, I think from the advice I've been given anyway, and I think the broader scientific consensus, you can come in and correct me, Kobe, is that stock recovery is possible, and that's the belief at the moment.
But that's the impression.
But not with the SSI in front of us.
Again, what we're talking about is trying to at least keep those minimum protections in place to allow us to do the work while we fill the evidence gaps.
It's very difficult with a stock in a poor state like we think Clyde cod is at the moment, to remove protections in a justified way.
Okay.
I have real concerns with it. Your policy justification for this SSI is, although evidence doesn't show something is not a problem, it also doesn't show that it is. But that's the justification of this SSI. I think it's a rather strange, and it sets a rather sinister precedent for government to be justifying policy on evidence that doesn't actually exist. I do have concerns over that. Beatrice Wishart.
Yeah, I guess my question is about if there is no closure in place, and you've sort of referred to other vessels coming in, what evidence is there out with the closure period of vessels coming in? I don't have an idea of what we're talking about.
Of other vessels that fish in the area?
Yeah.
Not huge.
Yeah.
So, one of the elements of the order is, as I said already, is introducing that access restriction to vessels that have got a track record. Now, in terms of the basics of how we manage fisheries, if you've got a licence, subject to some local restrictions, you could in theory fish anywhere in Scotland or indeed anywhere around the UK. And thinking about the Clyde has historically been important, for example, for the Northern Irish fleet, less so now than it has been in the past. So there's nothing in theory to stop a number of visiting vessels coming around and actually working in the Clyde, targeting specific species, such as nephrops, if the stock if it's attractive and profitable for them to do so. Hence why that additional measure that we're putting in place in the order to limit that access is to prevent that and to respect and protect the science programme.
I'm not sure I understand. I don't think that kind of answers my question. I'm trying to understand how many vessels, do you have an understanding in terms of a quantity of vessels that could come in? Or are you just saying it could be just open season and anybody could come in and that's it?
In terms of the actual, not the whole Clyde, but if we're talking about the specific box, the cod box as it's referred to. So there's vessel numbers in the BRIA, around about 50 vessels in total, a mix of trawl and creel vessels as well. Without the protection, in theory, you could have the whole Scottish fleet or UK fleet coming round and fishing the Clyde. Now, that's never going to happen, of course, but in theory you could. There's nothing stopping them doing that without this restriction in place.
Very briefly, Ariane Burgess.
If this SSI was annulled today, you've talked about, I asked about, could something come back at the beginning because of the next session? But also, could we bring this one back as a one-year initiative and in the meantime be looking for something better starting in the new session?
I don't know if that would be possible for me to do. I can't make any commitments in relation to that today.
Thank you. That concludes our questions. We now move on to the formal consideration of the motion to annul the instrument and invite Tim Eagle to speak to and move motion S6M 20686.
Well, thank you, Convener. I started this morning coming in actually slightly joking. I'd only got a 30-second speech. That's got slightly longer as the course of this morning's go on. So I'm going to read through what I've got here, and hopefully it makes a wee bit of sense as to why I will move the motion to annul today. I lodged this motion to annul after reflection on the round table we had with many stakeholders, and even following this morning, I do not believe the government has made a sufficiently strong or balanced case for proceeding in the way that is proposed. It seems to almost everyone there is a misalignment between what is being proposed and what the reality is on the ground. Like many, I do support sustainable fisheries. Healthy stocks and healthy coastal communities must go together. I want our fishing communities to thrive. The question it feels like the fishermen, the local community and environmental groups are asking us is not whether we act, but whether we are acting in the right way and on the right evidence. And after so many years of the cod box in place, I can see why those involved are justified in asking that. At committee, we heard a wide range of views from scientists, industry representatives and local stakeholders. That evidence was not settled. There was credible concern about the precision of the data, about how well the measures match actual stock behaviour, and about the real-world impacts on those who make their living at sea. The consultation responses reflected that very same picture. There was support for protecting stocks, but no clear consensus that the current approach is the correct or proportionate one. Many respondents questioned the design, the timing, and the likely effectiveness of the closure, and asked for a more collaborative and adaptive approach. That is why I believe the government should pause and think again, and that is why I've put forward this motion to annul. During the earlier debate, Rhoda Grant mentioned guarantees for committee should anything change or new measures imposed should this order be successful. I would make the strong argument the best possible way to develop this, given the massive uncertainty we are seeing across the board from key stakeholders, is to ask the government to pause now, reflect and move forward afresh. After 20 years or so, that seems a fair thing to do. What I find telling is that in the last few weeks, this committee has found ourselves in a situation with both the SSI around producer organisations in agriculture and this, which, whilst very different, share that we are effectively being told we must do this because of the impacts if we don't. I know I can't, in all good faith, continue to sit and vote for things which are widely questioned just because of a consequence of the government's making. It is not for me to defend the government, but maybe annulling this today, whilst bringing risks, might be the kickstarter that actually brings certain change for the better. If that were to happen, I can't suggest what should happen, but it seems surely that the government needs to bring the key groups around the table again, fishers, scientists, conservation bodies and local communities, and agree a forward plan that is transparent, evidence-led and workable on the ground. Better co-design will lead to better compliance and hopefully better outcomes. No one is saying that will be easy, and I take on point the Cabinet Secretary has said today, but everything is possible with the right approach. If it was the case and others felt they could support this annulment today, I would, though, make a strong plea. A year-on-year situation cannot be a fight for differing parties to campaign for radical measures or changes or the use of the Clyde as a media example. People's lives depend on this area. Communities are radically changed by proposals. Any discussions must be balanced and fair for those who live and work in the area, and I am aware that the Clydes Fishermen's Association are and have always been ready to work in a fair and open way with government and all partners. Annulment today is not about stopping progress. It is about getting the policy right, moving forward, and with that, I urge others to join me in voting for the annulment.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. Any other members? Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. I think it's been a very useful discussion this morning. I'm aware that annulling this SSI would mean that there's, for a period of time, no restriction in place to protect the Clyde cod. But the reason that I am leaning towards the annulment is that we heard during the stakeholder evidence session 2 weeks ago that the restrictions that we've had in place for years haven't protected this unique species of cod. This SSI promises more of the same for 3 years. I mean, it was good to hear the detail of various bits and pieces of what you're proposing, but supposedly in the name of science, despite the fact that we already have perfectly good scientific evidence which clearly shows that the Clyde cod are in decline and will continue to be in decline should these measures remain in place. This evidence, which has been collected by Professor Mike Heath and his team at the University of Strathclyde, has been peer-reviewed and independently modelled, and it should be the basis of government decisions made on this issue. What it clearly shows is that mortality is the principal issue behind Clyde cod's decline. The most likely reason for this mortality, it says, is that the cod is appearing as bycatch in the Neffrots trawl fishery. To put this more bluntly, trawlers are killing off this species. So if we want to properly protect Clyde cod and give it a chance of regenerating, common sense dictates that we need to have better controls over trawling in the Firth of Clyde. If we vote to annul this SSI today, I'd like the government to come back before dissolution, hopefully not disillusioned, with a proposal for a one-year protection measure. I appreciate that timescales would be tight, although I feel that the government needs to carry the can for this situation, given it's brought this SSI at the last minute. And I think there's something to be, some food for thought there, that we're talking about this SSI in a few weeks up to when the closures would be coming in. It would be far better if we were having these conversations in September, October, November. But one damaging year would be significantly better than 3 damaging years. And even if this SSI cannot make it back in time for dissolution, 1 year of no restrictions would be vastly better than 3 years of restrictions that don't work anyway. And given our conversation that there's a legal requirement for the government to actually act on this, I would trust that there's an impetus to continue the work. A year should provide enough time for fishers, officials, scientists and other organisations to get together to work out a better way of protecting Clyde cod. There are plenty of options for this working group to consider. The extreme scenario would be involving banning all trawls in the Firth of Clyde during the spawning season. More amenable options could be the creation of static gear reserves during the spawning season, as this would greatly reduce bycatch, or a requirement for trawls to use adaptation, and we heard about that. But more requirement, I didn't feel confident that the government actually has an understanding, the Marine Director, of what gear is being used, such as the Swedish grid. By getting everyone around the table, the government can work out what the impacts on Clyde cod will be for each measure and balance them against the socioeconomic impacts of restricting fishing in the Firth of Clyde. So I'm inclined at this point to support the call to annul this SSI.
Any other members? Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Convener. There's obviously been a lot discussed today. The committee has taken an awful lot of evidence in relation to this instrument, and I think there are just a few points that I would like to come to in closing and cover. Ultimately, what we are trying to do is strike the right balance, take measured, proportionate steps that strike that balance between meeting our legal obligations, protecting the stock that we know is vulnerable, as well as considering the wider socio-economic impacts of any decisions that we take. I do think some of what has been discussed about and what's been raised in some of the comments that Tim Eagle have touched on, what Ariane Burgess have touched on, in relation to how important that collaboration and that wider piece is. I believe that we are doing that. I believe that the science programme that we've developed has that collaboration, because that's exactly what it has been about. It's about working with our fishermen, it's about working with our scientists to make sure that we fill those evidence gaps in the models that exist. Sorry, but yes.
Take an intervention. I mean, I think I hear your point about the collaboration, but we've heard from so many different stakeholders around this issue that are clearly don't want this SSI, and it's from all forms of the 360 degrees. So I hear the collaboration, but clearly some people are not feeling that they're really fully involved and engaged in the collaboration, and possibly the collaboration is happening. Something I've observed over time with government is that sometimes collaboration starts to happen once the government already has its mind made up, and that actually with a more inclusive co-design, co-production process, that needs to start much, much earlier on.
But again, I would say, and I understand the criticism from your comments earlier in saying that this instrument has come quite late in the day and we're discussing it late, but I think that's because of all the detailed work that has gone into bringing it forward, and that has involved extensive engagement, extensive consultation and work in the period by that time. And that, yes.
Again, I'm sort of confused. This is something we often hear. We've heard it when it's come to agriculture policy, when instruments at the end of the day, we hear the Minister saying, oh, there's extensive consultation, but almost unanimously, we had a table of scientists and we had a round table with stakeholders. And if I'd asked for a show of hands of those who supported the SSI, I'm sure we would have had unanimous agreement that this was not the instrument they wanted to see. And given that in the past there has been voluntary schemes which would actually show that the sector and the NGOs do want to work together to get a sustainable fishery in the Clyde, that despite what you say and that there's been all this negotiation, we've arrived at a point where it would appear that no stakeholders are supportive of this instrument, because either it doesn't go far enough or it damages fishing interests which actually have little impact on the cod population. So that co-design and co-development hasn't worked, or we wouldn't be at this point. We'd be sitting around here, or we wouldn't be sitting here at all. This SSI would have gone ahead without a motion to annul.
But I think in saying that, ensuring that we're working collaboratively with industry doesn't necessarily we're going to get 100% of our stakeholders on board, and that isn't always going to be possible, and it wouldn't always be possible necessarily in this space because of the very diverse and polarised views that exist, and you've seen that, you've heard that directly, and you've received it in relation to your evidence. I think I would just want to go back to a point that Ariane Burgess made about a one-year instrument, and I think that my concern with that is that we just get into the cycle of preparing for another one-year instrument, which then interrupts the scientific work that could take place in trying to build that wider picture and fill some of the evidence gaps that we know exist. Because I think the Strathclyde model that you've heard about is an excellent model, as Kobe has outlined, but we also know that there are data gaps in there. It's not up to date, and that's exactly why we want to work to fill those gaps, and to do that with our scientific advisors, as well as to do that with our fishermen too. And ultimately, through the scientific programme and the closed period, there would be that limited access as well, which, as Jim highlighted when he mentioned earlier, that we've had that engagement with the industry on, and that the fishermen are at least broadly content with, as far as I understand. So I think we're not sitting still for 3 years. That's not what this is about. It's about adaptive management. It's about learning as we go, and not least through looking at some of the improvements that are going to develop in that time, such as we've discussed at length today through the future catching policy. And I would just finish by urging the committee members not to annul this instrument. It would open the area. It would mean that we don't have any closure in place at a time when we know the stock is particularly vulnerable. I think maintaining these proportionate precautionary measures, keeping the closure in place and engaging in the science programme and capping the access is the best way forward, so that hopefully when we are sitting around this table, well, I won't be, but others potentially will be in future, we're working from as strong an evidence base as possible in which to inform the management measures at that point.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Tim Eagle to wind up and press or withdraw the motion.
I mean, I haven't really got much more to say. I actually appreciate what the Cabinet Secretary is saying. I really do. And I don't think this is an easy decision for any of us. I think we all want the best for that region. But I stand by what I've said. I think what Ariane Burgess said is right. You always know where something is wrong when the Greens and the Conservatives start coming together. But this is, there is an issue here. And frankly, whether it's expert advice from people on the ground, there is clearly an issue here. Clearly, this SSI isn't the right approach. And therefore, I move the annulment. I move the motion.
The question is that motion S6M 20686 is agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the motion, raise your hands now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 5 for, 4 against. The motion has therefore been agreed. The committee will report on the instrument and invite the committee to delegate authority to me as the convener to finalise the report for the publication. Do members agree? Agreed. Thank you. That completes consideration of the negative instrument. I now suspend this meeting for 10 minutes for a comfort break and a changeover of witnesses. I suspend the meeting. next item of business today is consideration of the Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill at Stage 2. And I welcome back Jim Fairley, the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity, who is supported by his colleagues from the Scottish Government. As we have three members participating remotely. I'll briefly explain the procedure for hybrid Stage 2. If at any time we lose connection, I will suspend the meeting and proceedings. Emma Harper, Emma Roddick, Rhoda Grant and Alistair Allen's cameras should be kept on at all times, and they should raise their hands at the appropriate time for voting. I now call Amendment 156 in the name of Ariane Burgess Group, with amendments as shown in the groupings. Ariane Burgess to move Amendment 156 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. I move Amendment 156, which was drafted in collaboration with Ramblers and requires the Government to have regard to the knowledge and experience of members it appoints to the newly merged court. And I really appreciate the Government's discussions, constructive discussions ahead of this session. Specifically, this amendment brings in measures where we want to see members in the court who have experience and knowledge of land access matters in rural and urban settings. I believe we can all agree that this is in the interests of everyone who will interact with this court, because we must ensure that everyone bringing or defending land access cases receives the best justice possible. And my amendment would ensure consistency, efficiency and specialist handling of access disputes, particularly where land management and public rights interact. Access cases often involve nuanced interpretation of the Scottish Outdoor Access Code and land use practices, and a dedicated forum that's overseen with the right expertise will offer better informed outcomes than the Generalist Sheriff Court currently does. I have spoken, as I said, with the Minister about this amendment and understand that a less specific mechanism is in place which allows for the right expertise to be put in place. However, I want to assure that there are routes stakeholders and other interested parties can take to ensure any knowledge gaps in the Land Court are addressed. And if the Minister could provide me with reassurances on this, I'd be content not to press this amendment.
Thank you. Minister, to speak to Amendment 102 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'll first of all address Ariane Burgess's Amendment 156. As this bill transfers certain access rights, matters to the Land Court, I recognise that such an experience may be relevant to parts of its future work. However, the Court's jurisdiction is very broad. It's covering crofting, land, valuation, agricultural holdings, and under the bill, the functions of the Lands Tribunal. So to operate effectively, the Court needs a balanced membership selected on merit from a wide range of backgrounds. The judicial appointments process is already designed to assess the full range of skills and experience that candidates bring and ensure that they are capable of handling all of the work of the Court. If it were considered desirable to reflect particular experience, ministers will have the powers to do that through making eligibility regulations. That's the proper route for bringing in specific experience where it's needed. So for these reasons, while I understand the member's intention, I would ask Ms Burgess not to press Amendment 156. And if she does, I would ask members not to support it. So I'll speak to the remaining amendments in this group, Amendments 102 to 105. Strengthen the provisions on the eligibility for the appointment as Deputy Chair of the Court. They provide a clear and flexible approach that allows the role to be filled whenever required, including where the Chair of the Court is unable to act and no eligible existing member can be designated to take on that role. To maintain consistency with the rigorous appointments process, these amendments also provide that Scottish ministers may appoint a non-member as a duty chair, deputy chair, only where no current member is eligible and only where the individual has already been through the Judicial Appointments Board for Scotland's recruitment process and appointed. And the appointment is temporary and agreed with the Lord President.
For a minute, could you just adjust your microphone? Thank you very much.
Better?
That's fine. Thank
Apologies. So these amendments allow Scottish ministers to temporarily appoint a deputy chair, from a broader group within the Scottish judiciary, specifically sheriffs and sheriff principals with at least 10 years of experience. So I would encourage members to support Amendments 102, 103, 104 and 105. For 107, 108, 109, 112, 113, 114, 122, 123 and 24, which, following feedback, improve the approach to reviews and appeals when the two bodies are merged, with the ability to update it in the future where necessary. The Land Court and the Lands Tribunal currently operate with different review and appeal structures, and this package also streamlines how internal reviews will operate, ensuring that the right members deal with them and that the Court is not drawn into unnecessary or duplicate stages. For Amendments 107, 112 and 124, together they create a coherent mechanism for updating the new Court's internal review and appeal arrangements. In particular, they provide a mechanism to deal with the review and appeal of cases under the transferred Lands Tribunal jurisdiction, so that the wider set of reforms operate coherently and there is flexibility to ensure that bespoke arrangements can be made as required. Amendment 112 gives ministers a power exercised by affirmative regulations to specify which matters are not subject to internal review by the Court and to adjust how cases are appealed to the Court of Session. Importantly, any such changes cannot be made unless ministers have formally consulted the Lord President and the Chair of the Court. Building on that requirement provides judicial oversight and helps to make sure that any future procedural reforms are proportionate, workable and consistent with the wider justice system, strengthening the safeguards around the new flexibility. So for these reasons, I ask members to support all the amendments I've just mentioned. Amendments 118 and 119 make a small but important adjustment to the rule-making process by requiring the Scottish Civil Justice Council and the Court of Session to consult the Chair of the Scottish Land Court when preparing the procedural rules for that court. That recognised the specialist nature of the Lands Court work, and this is reflected in the development of those rules. So for this reason, I would ask members to support Amendments 118 and 199. And finally, Amendment 129 concerns the appointment of members to the Scottish Land Court. The Judicial Appointments Board for Scotland, or JABS, is responsible for recommending individuals for judicial office, supporting an open and transparent judicial appointments process in Scotland. Amendment 129 provides for the involvement of the Scottish Land Court in appointments made by JABS, and it means that when the Board is considering an appointment to the Court, at least one member of the Land Court will take part in those proceedings, with that member selected by the Chair of the Court after consulting the Board's chairing member. That mirrors the established Scottish Tribunal appointments process, where the relevant body's specialist knowledge is built into the Board's consideration. That will ensure that the particular experience of the Land Court is available to the Board when required. So for this reason, I would ask members to support Amendment 129. And that's everything.
Thank you, Minister. Any other members? No. Ariane Burgess to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 156.
I've got nothing further to add, and I'm going to withdraw the amendment.
The members indicated they wish to withdraw the amendment. Does any member object? No. I call Amendment 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, 113, 114 and 115, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. I invite the Minister to move Amendments 102 to 115 en bloc.
Moved en bloc, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 102 to 115? No. So the question is that Amendments 102 to 115 are agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 116 in the name of the Minister, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Minister to move Amendment 116 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I move Amendment 116 in my name. Amendment 116 and 117 are technical amendments following the enactment of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2025, updating the bill so that the Scottish Land Court's jurisdiction correctly reflects the Small Landholder Scotland Acts of 1886 to 1931 and the small landholdings provisions in Schedule 2 of the 2025 Act, and I would encourage members to support them. Amendment 157 from Ariane Burgess, I'm going to talk to that just now because that would expand the competence and the jurisdiction of the Scottish Land Court to include a wide range of environmental matters. And I acknowledge that the Scottish Government has indicated that consideration will be given to the expanded Land Court taking on new functions in relation to cases arising under the Aarhus Convention at a future point, but we have intentionally not sought to do so at this time, and I'd like to explain why. Firstly, the merger of the Scottish Land Court and the Land Tribunal for Scotland will take time to complete. It will require the development of a new set of court rules, the introduction of a new case management system and the transfer of staff and members. So adding such a substantial new set of responsibilities at the same time could have a serious impact on the effectiveness of the new court. And such a significant change would merit a specific consultation process with all stakeholders before a decision is made. Secondly, we don't consider it appropriate for the expanded Land Court to take on the functions of a criminal environmental court, given the distinct procedural and institutional requirements of criminal proceedings. Such cases are appropriately considered in the Sheriff Courts or the High Court, where there is already considerable judicial knowledge and experience. And thirdly, while we acknowledge calls from a range of stakeholders for improvements to access to justice in environmental matters, we have already made progress in that regard through the abolition of court fees for Aarhus cases in the Court of Session and the introduction of protective expenses orders, or PEOs, to limit legal costs. I also note that the Scottish Civil Justice Council has agreed to hold a wide-ranging consultation this year on extending the availability of environmental PEOs, including all relevant cases in the Sheriff Court and the Sheriff Appeal Court. So the Scottish Government's present position is that most environmental law matters can be dealt with effectively by the current civil courts and processes. And finally, the bill allows for future extension of the competence and the jurisdiction of the Land Court if and when it is right to do so, ensuring that a controlled and a proportionate approach that avoids overwhelming a newly merged court. In line with the Committee's recommendation in the Stage 1 report, Parliament will be able to give careful scrutiny to any such proposal, as regulations to make any change will be subject to the affirmative procedure. Amendments 164 and 165 from Ariane Burgess are consequential on Amendment 157, which would expand the competence and jurisdiction of the Scottish Land Court to include that wide range of environmental matters. Amendment 164 concerns certain provisions of the Environmental Protection Act 1990. Statutory nuisance cases are heard in Sheriff Courts because they need to be dealt with quickly, locally and by courts that have long established expertise in this type of work. Moving them into the National Court could significantly weaken that accessibility and, in practice, could require the Land Court to acquire physical court spaces and facilities right across Scotland, potentially driving up capital expenditure at a time when we're focused on controlling public spending. And Amendment 165 would expand the competence and jurisdiction of the court to include all matters under the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act 1997. Now, the Court of Session exercises Scotland's supervisory jurisdiction, and it is the established forum for questioning the legality of planning decisions. So I want to be absolutely clear that the Court of Session is where such a statutory planning challenge properly belongs. These functions do not sit naturally with the history, expertise or the purpose of the Scottish Land Court, which has always been a specialist forum for crofting, agricultural holdings and rural land matters. Diverting planning challenges would fundamentally change the nature and the character of the Land Court, which I have committed to preserving throughout the process of this bill. Although the likely increase in case volume arising from these amendments and Amendment 157 is unknown, the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service considers that the expansion of the court's jurisdiction would have a significant operational and financial impact, and any such change would benefit from proper consultation before any decision is taken. So in conclusion, Convener, the Scottish Government position is that it does not see a compelling argument for the creation of a special environment court in Scotland, nor for expanding the competence and jurisdiction of the court as 164 and 165 propose at this time. I acknowledge Ariane Burgess' reason for lodging the amendments, but for the reasons I have just explained, I would ask her not to move them. Amendment 158 from Ariane Burgess seeks to prevent the award of expenses against the person who raises any environmental rights action or any subsequent appeal. Now, I understand the intention is to seek to protect the person raising an action from having to pay the legal expenses of the other party, which could be substantial if that action is unsuccessful. However, it is not clear from the amendment what constitutes an environmental rights action, as no definition is proposed. As a consequence, this is a very expansive provision which, when read in conjunction with Amendment 157, may be liable to have unintended consequences. Environmental cases cover a very wide range, everything from lower value nuisance disputes in the Sheriff Court right through to complex judicial reviews in the Court of Session. Applying automatic cost protection across that whole spectrum carries very real risks. Separately, it is important to recognise that the Scottish Government has already taken meaningful steps to address concerns about the costs to individuals seeking to access to justice on environmental matters. And as with Amendment 157, I note that the Scottish Civil Justice Courts Council intends to consult this year on extending the availability of environmental protection orders for a significantly widened scope of environmental cases. That includes a proposal that if a PEO is granted, the maximum cap will be £5,000, but with the ability for the court to lower that figure through judicial discretion. So the Scottish Government is keen to allow the SCJC to complete its work in this area before considering whether any other reform is required. So on that basis, I'd ask Ariane Burgess not to move Amendment 158. On Amendment 159, it seeks to include the definition of the Aarhus Convention on the face of the bill. And as I've argued against Amendments 157 and 158 from the member, which give rise to the need for the definition, I ask that she also does not move this amendment. Amendment 214 in the name of Tim Eagle. So let me say, first of all, I'm not opposed in principle to holding a review of the effectiveness of the merger of the Scottish Land Court and the Land Tribunal for Scotland. But I do need to be clear about two fundamental principles before we go any further, and that we must not compromise. And that, first of all, is the judicial independence. Ministers cannot and must not be drawn into commenting on judicial deployment, expertise or decision-making. And secondly, the independence of the Scottish Courts and Tribunals Service. Trying not to say tribunals, my apologies. The Scottish Ministers do not oversee the performance of the SCTS. It is accountable directly to Parliament. So therefore it is essential that any review we put into statute respects those boundaries. It's also worth noting that some of the information the amendment seeks is already available through the existing SCTS and judicial reporting, including annual accounts, operational costs, caseload data, waiting times and annual judicial business reports. Yes.
I think, Minister, I'm actually pretty easy about this one. I think what I was trying to do here, because when I've asked for reviews before on the sort of on primary legislation, I don't always think it's helpful or necessary to do that, and I'm not necessarily sure it is here. I guess what I was looking for is there were some concerns raised when we had this part of the discussion during the evidence session. So I'm happy not to push this today, actually, but I suppose I'm just looking for that guarantee that you see that there could be potential difficulties and that would be monitored moving forward.
Well, let me finish up. I am quite happy to speak to the member to go to stage 3, because there is the potential to bring an amendment back that would do the very thing that the member is seeking to do. But I'll talk to Ariane Burgess's Amendment 160, because there are similarities there. So I'll finish my notes and then we will take it from there. As I said, Amendment 160 from Ariane Burgess requires Scottish Ministers to update existing statutory guidance given under Section 27 of the Land Reform Scotland Act 2003, following the transfer of matters of jurisdiction outlined in Schedule 1, paragraph 16, relating to access rights from the Sheriff Court to the Scottish Land Court. So the Scottish Government recognised that following the commencement of Part 2 of the Bill, there will be a requirement to update this in order to inform local authorities about the extended competence and jurisdiction of the Land Court with regard to access rights. So we would undertake this as a matter of course as part of the routine practice of revising guidance whenever relevant statutory changes arise. However, there may be merit in explicitly setting this out here to clarify the Scottish Government's intention to revise the guidance following commencement and to reassure stakeholders, particularly local authorities, that updated information will be provided to reflect the extended competence and jurisdiction of the Land Court in relation to those access rights. That said, we do not consider that the amendment as drafted will have the effect intended by the member, given the link to the coming into force of Section 35. It is possible that paragraph 16 of Schedule 1 will not be commenced or not be commenced in full at the same time as Section 35. However, we are willing to support this amendment at stage 3 if the member works with us to amend the drafting errors. Amendment 161 in the name of Ariane Burgess would require that a review be undertaken of the impact in the Land Court of the extension of its competence and jurisdiction to matters relating to access rights after a 3-year period. Having undertaken such a review, Scottish Ministers would need to publish and lay a report before the Scottish Parliament. As with Amendment 160, we do not consider that the amendment as drafted will have the effect intended by the member, given the link to coming into force of Section 35. But again, we're willing to work with Ariane Burgess to bring forward a workable alternative review at stage 3, so I therefore invite her not to move that. Amendment 162 in the name of Ariane Burgess would require Scottish Ministers to establish an expert working group to review the environmental jurisdiction of the court no later than 6 months following royal assent. Now, that amendment would be considered to be in conflict with Amendment 157, also from Ariane Burgess, which would expand the competence and jurisdiction of the Scottish Land Court to include a wide range of environmental matters from the date of commencement of Section 35. So I presume that this is an alternative, and I would look forward to hearing what Ariane Burgess says in her remarks. But as I've already explained, there is some interaction between this amendment and the amendment from 214 from Tim Eagle, which seeks a review of the effectiveness of the merger of the Court and Lands Tribunal at defined intervals. So the proposal to review the jurisdiction of the court with particular reference to environmental matters is in principle something the Government is willing to consider. However, we consider the way in which this amendment is framed raises a number of significant practical and legal issues. Firstly, we consider the commencement review within 6 months royal assent is too soon. The merger of the Lands Court and the Scottish the Tribunal and the Land Court will not have taken place at that point, and no experience have yet been gained from the operation of the new court. And from a legal perspective, we are not aware of any legislation that has previously required ministers to establish an expert working group such as this, and the status of such a group in law would therefore be unclear. That may be significant in particular if the group did not deliver on its objectives. The Court's environmental jurisdiction is not defined, and if Amendment 157 in the name of Ariane Burgess is not passed, then the meaning of this amendment would be uncertain. So finally, although the proposed membership of the expert working group appears to be broad in representation, it does omit representation from the Court itself. There may be other stakeholder groups that are not specified, such as local authorities and trade unions, who would have important contributions to make to any review of the Court's competence and jurisdiction. It would also likely cut across the work of the Scottish Civil Justice Council, which has the statutory function of keeping the civil justice system under review and is in the process of reviewing access to justice for environmental actions. So in conclusion, Convener, the Scottish Government position is that Amendment 162 would not deliver the outcomes that I think Ariane Burgess is looking for. So for that reason, I'd invite her not to move that amendment and instead engage further to consider an alternative approach in advance of Stage 3. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Ariane Burgess to speak to Amendment 157 and other amendments in the group.
I'd like to begin by saying that we should all be concerned that Scotland isn't meeting its international obligations when it comes to people's access to environmental justice. We're currently in breach of the Aarhus Convention, which was signed more than 25 years ago, especially Article 9, which requires access to environmental justice to be fair, equitable, timely, and not prohibitively expensive. And I have a sense that we're all believers in fair access to justice. So we really need to ensure that we're moving forward providing such a system for the people of Scotland. And there's a wider point to make here about meeting our international obligations, which is about being taken seriously and to be trusted on the world stage. And we must abide by treaties and other agreements we've signed up to. Aarhus is an example which is part of the reason why I view this amendment and the subsequent amendments, consequential amendments, as being of such urgent importance. And I do appreciate the conversations, discussions I've had with the Minister and officials ahead of this Stage 2 debate. In the policy memorandum accompanying this bill, the Scottish Government states that it wants there to be consideration around providing the Scottish Land Court with jurisdiction over environmental cases at some point in the future. And I did hear in the Minister's remarks, again, now's not the time, some point in the future. While I welcome that the Government didn't shy away from the matter in the memorandum, it's beyond time that we stop taking baby steps on this issue and start taking big strides instead. Amendment 157 I'm a bit confused here. Wait a minute. Yep. Amendment 157, which I've worked on with the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, would give the newly merged Scottish Land Court jurisdiction over environmental cases. In practice, this would mean communities would have clear, low-cost route to bringing cases against a nearby factory that's spewing out nasty emissions, for example. Likewise, a charity could bring an environmental case against the government without having to find thousands of pounds to fund it. This amendment would bring Scotland into line with many other nations around the world where land and environmental courts are the norm. Examples of this combination can be seen in Sweden, Kenya, New South Wales, Australia. The latter is the oldest specialist environmental court in the world and has operated successfully since 1980. Providing environmental jurisdiction would also be a big step towards meeting our House obligations, creating a one-stop shop for such cases. As we heard during our evidence sessions on this bill, especially the one with the Principal Clerk of the existing Land Court, Alison Irvine, from an administrative point of view, there's nothing stopping us giving the court this jurisdiction. The only question would be over resourcing. She also stated that, and I quote, "The Land Court already has a number of niche jurisdictions, so it's used to dealing with a range of different pieces of legislation." Ms Irvine added that the court already deals with appeals against some Scottish Environmental Protection Agency decisions, so it's not a great leap for us to agree today to give this court an environmental jurisdiction. I will, however, say I take on board the discussions yesterday about the complexity of that. Another key thing to say about this amendment is I can see a point coming where a number of environmental cases going through the courts will begin to rise. Issues caused by climate and biodiversity are set to become more acute in the near term, so it's highly likely that the demands on our justice system will go up in tandem. It's imperative that we begin to develop the relevant expertise in our legal system now so we can avoid the public expense and resource that will be required to play catch-up in the future. So I appreciated hearing from the Minister about his thoughts in this space. Amendment 158, 159, 164 and 165 are consequentials to Amendment 157. Amendment 158 would enable us to meet our House Article 9 obligations in a land court that's reformed by Amendment 157. It would protect individuals or groups from having to pay the other side's costs in unsuccessful environmental actions, and this would create a much more level playing field between those bringing cases, more of whom tend to be charities or communities, and those defending them, who tend to have deep pockets. And I do take on board the Minister's comments about this amendment lacking clarity around what's meant by environmental action, and also that the Scottish Government's already taking steps through, I believe, a consultation or work being done by the Civil Justice Courts Council, looking into a maximum fine and an ability to lower the fine, to lower the fee via judicial discretion. So that's very welcome. Indeed, Amendment 162 is a fallback amendment to 157. It would require ministers to set up a working group consisting of all key stakeholders in the environmental justice space, and this working group would look at the feasibility of setting up an environmental court and handing environmental cases to the Land Court. The government would then be required to review and release a statement on the group's findings. Such a measure would at least move us away from the government saying good things about environmental rights but not taking action. I think it would provide an opportunity for the government to communicate what it is already doing as well. It would also do this in a transparent way, which is what the committee is called for, clarity on scope, resourcing and access to justice impacts, as we set out in our report. I do recognise from what the Minister said in his statement just now that there are drafting issues, and I would appreciate working with him and officials ahead of stage 3 on this. I'm now going to move to Amendments 160 and 161, which relate to land access elements in Schedule 1. And again, I would appreciate a very constructive conversation, discussion on these ahead of this stage. One of the welcome elements of the Scottish Land Court part of the bill was that its jurisdiction would include land access cases. In recent years, we've seen several high-profile instances of land access disputes. But translating these disputes from wars of words to the court system has proven to be a challenge, and I firmly believe that the change this bill will make will go some way towards improving the situation. I would, however, like to make a few tweaks to ensure that we're getting the best possible hub for land access justice. Amendment 161 which I worked on with Ramblers, would require that the government produces a report on the nature and number of land access cases being brought to the Land Court after a period of 3 years. This is crucial because it would enable us to identify and rectify any issues that prevent people from bringing these cases, and in turn build confidence in the newly merged court's ability to handle land access cases. Amendment 160 would require ministers to update the access rights guidance required under 2003 Act, and this would ensure that the route for land access disputes to take would be clear to all. It would also update guidance that's now more than 20 years old and isn't in line with the changes in practice and the law that have occurred in this time. So I believe this measure would be positive impact on the running of the Land Court when it comes to handling cases. And I appreciate again what the Minister had to say about working with him and officials ahead of Stage 2 on these 2 amendments. Thank you.
Tim Eagle to speak to Amendment 214 and other amendments in the group.
Yes, thank you very much. I've got very little to add, actually. Really, this amendment just came forward based on some of the concerns that were raised during the committee evidence sessions, but I've heard what the Minister said this morning, and I'll work with him before Stage 3.
Minister, to wind up.
Thank you, Convener. To take on the points that Ariane Burgess has made, we are committed to compliance with the Aarhus Convention. We're already taking forward a range of measures that are set out previously. There's also further work underway on legal aid reforming, consideration of issues raised by the Aarhus Convention Compliance Committee. Environmental Standards Scotland, established under the Continuity Act, provides an accessible alternative route for individuals and organisations to raise concerns about the effective implementation of environmental law, offering a means of resolving issues without the cost and complexity associated with court proceedings. So, I fully take on board the concerns that Ariane Burgess has raised, but I think there's a lot of work ongoing, and I would ask her to bear that in mind as we go through the amendments that we've got in front of us. And I have nothing further to add. Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is that Amendment 116 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 157 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 116. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so won't be considered. I call Amendments 117, 118, 119, 120, 121, 122, 123 and 124, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. I invite the Minister to move Amendments 117 to 124 en bloc.
Moved en bloc, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 117 to 124? So the question is that Amendment 117 to 124 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 158 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 116. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so will not be considered. I call Amendment 159 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 116. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, will not be considered. The question is that Schedule 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. The question is that Sections 36 to 39 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 214 in the name of Tim Eagle, already debated with Amendment 116. Tim Eagle, to move or not move? That has not been moved, so will not be considered. I call Amendment 160 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 116. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
It's not been moved, so will not be considered. I call Amendment 116 in the name of Ariane Burgess. 161, I beg your pardon, in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 116. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
It's not moved, so won't be considered. Call Amendment 162 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 116. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
It's not moved, so will not be considered. The question is that Section 40 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 125 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 2. Minister, to move formally.
Moved, Convener.
The question is that Amendment 125 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 126 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 42. Minister, to move formally.
Moved, Convener.
Then the question is that Amendment 126 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. I call Amendment 163 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 65. Ariane Burgess to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 163 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are not all agreed. There will be a division. Those supporting the amendment, please raise your hand now. Those members opposed? Those members wishing to abstain? And the result of the vote is 7 for, 2 against. The amendment has therefore been agreed. I call Amendment 127 in the name of the Minister, already debated with Amendment 2. Minister to move formally.
Moved, Convener.
And the question is that Amendment 127 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 164 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 116. Ariane Burgess to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so will not be considered. Call Amendment 165 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 116. Ariane Burgess to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved and will not be considered. I call Amendments 128, 129, 130, 131, all in the name of the Minister and all previously debated. I invite the Minister to move Amendments 128 to 131 en bloc.
Moved en bloc, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 128 to 131? And the question is that Amendments 128 to 131 are all agreed. Are agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. The question is that Schedule 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. The question is that Section 41 and 42 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. I call Amendment 215 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 211. Ariane Burgess to move or not move?
Not moved.
That has not been moved, so will not be considered. The question is that Section 43 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are all agreed. The question is that Section 44 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. The question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. And that ends Stage 2 consideration of the bill. Thank you all very much for your attendance. Thank you all for this morning. And that concludes our business in public, and we now move into private session, and I suspend the meeting to allow witnesses to leave. Thank you.